Chapter 755. Once upon a time, there was a mountain, a temple in the mountain, and a person in the temple. That person told a story. He said, once upon a time, there was a mountain. If Fan Xian's experience in the temple continued to develop like this, without question, the people everywhere in the world who were eagerly waiting for him to live or die would be covered in many layers of cobwebs and then dragged to death. Just like the world after the calamity, regardless of cause and effect or something else, it was impossible to always sink into a dull repetition. The rebirth of a civilization after its destruction could not be completely the same as before. Even the only remaining temple in the world, at the beginning of humankind's second rise, began to endlessly send the seeds of the last civilization to humankind through the blindfolded emissary. The most obvious change between the two worlds could not escape Fan Xian's eyes. After being reborn for more than 20 years, he meditated and practiced the tyrannical martial method every day. In this year, he had also begun to sense the yuanqi that filled the world. This was the true difference. Human society seemed to have found a way to develop it. The meridians in the human body were clear proof of this change. If the yuanqi in the world and the zhenqi in the human body belonged to the same path, then they were all traces left in the world after the calamity hundreds of thousands of years ago. They were traces left behind by nature. But, why did these traces not kill the humans living in them? Using the explanation of the voice in the temple, perhaps adapting to the environment and finding a certain point of balance and benefit in this adaptation was a tenacious characteristic that life itself possessed. Thinking of this, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. Sitting cross-legged on the ground, he was speechless for a long time. In his heart, the civilization that he had thought was the most tenacious and impossible to extinguish was, in reality, the most fragile existence. However, the seemingly fragile life became the strongest and most fearless existence in the face of an iron-like reality. Humans had adapted to this kind of environment. The newly grown plants and animals had also adapted to this environment. Fan Xian closed his eyes and thought carefully about everything he had seen and heard since his rebirth. He suddenly found that, regardless of whether it was humans or animals, they did not seem to have changed much because of the yuanqi that filled the world. This reality truly made him dumbfounded. Although radiation was terrifying, in the long river of time, it was actually nothing more than a fresh and moving painting. After an indeterminable amount of time, Fan Xian finally shook off this shock and confusion. The image on the smooth mirror in the air above the temple had already left Dong Mountain and began to show all kinds of vivid images. Some people were quietly hunting in the dense forest, some people were happily working in the fields, there were women smiling and washing clothes by the stream, there were children learning to walk clumsily on the Kong bed. There was smoke, there were villages, there were cities, there were palaces, and naturally, there were disputes, wars, killings, and bloodshed. The scene gradually slowed down, and scenes of martial arts cultivators appeared. They were either sitting on a lotus or spread out on a mountain peak, incomparably tenacious, eating and sleeping in the open. Over the years, they looked up at the sky and down at the sea, looking out at the wilderness, looking straight into the heart, breathing in the residual qi of heaven and earth, exhaling the turbid qi of the body, and finally one day, the martial arts of the continent gradually formed. Come, come, come. Fan Xian felt that when he saw these scenes, he did not feel as if he was floating. It was all thanks to the solid foundation laid down by the Overwatch Council's education when he was young. Even so, after seeing the true scene of the land changing, his state of mind was still shaken. A bitter and strange smile rose to the corners of his lips. Facing the mirror in front of him, he called out in a raspy voice, "Tell me, since martial secrets and such things are cultivated by people, why are there so many powerful things in the temple?" He casually stole 2 books and created a few grandmasters in the world. Without waiting for the temple to speak, Fan Xian coughed and rushed to say, "We have already talked to this point. Presumably, you have long analyzed my origins. Don't talk nonsense like it is some fairy technique left behind by the god realm." The temple was silent for a long time. Then, the voice calmly rang out again. For countless years, the temple has always observed the world. We will gather information and analyze it. Then, we will combine it with the unique characteristics of humans to carry out summaries and corrections. In the end, we have research results in a few directions. So, this was the origin of the martial methods that his mother, Yi Qingmei, had secretly taken out of the temple. However, thinking about it carefully, it made sense. If it was not for an extremely brilliant vision and methods, the heart of countless sects that were not passed on to outsiders, and the vast amount of information to choose from, who in the secular world could be like the temple and use countless years to carefully select these things? You have passed on many useful methods to the world. This was something that had appeared in the earlier images. Fan Xian would not erase the usefulness of this ruin for the passing on of civilization. He was silent for a moment and then said, when opening up the wastelands, the temple even directly sent out emissaries to help humans deal with giant beasts that were difficult to deal with. Later, they also passed on many skills to establish a foothold in the natural world. Why did you not directly pass on these methods to humans? Or, there must be a lot of information in the temple. Why have you always hidden it? Speaking of this, he was finally close to the woman. Thinking of how his mother, Yi Qingmei's death could not be separated from the temple, regardless of whether it was the martial methods that Yi Qingmei stole out of the temple or the craftsmanship in the palace treasury that surpassed the natural development of human society, Fan Xian's heart chilled slightly. In a raspy voice, he stared at the mirror of light and faintly said, "Furthermore, you will break your own rules and chase after those people everywhere. There are no those people. There is only one person." The temple's voice remained calm. Perhaps it was because it still had not come to a definite conclusion about Fan Xian's analysis from the information and conversation, so the temple's answer appeared particularly honest. "We are protectors. We are protecting the last spark of human civilization to sprout again. We want the remnant of humans to be able to live in this world again. This is our mission. The temple will pass on some suitable skills and knowledge to the world, such as irrigation, rice, and martial arts skills. We will not try to forcefully influence everything in the world," Fan Xian suddenly said. Fan Xian suddenly opened his mouth and said, "You say you are only a protector and not a controller, but you have cast the shadow of the temple over the heads of humans for many years. Furthermore, you have always tried to plan a world you think is perfect according to your own imaginations." His brows furrowed slightly. "It has been 1,000 years. The Wei Kingdom has been founded for 1,000 years. This world has not actually changed in any fundamental way." The temple's voice was silent for a long time. Then, for the first time, it used a rhetorical tone to say, "Is this not good? Was this good? Or was it not good?" No one could say for sure. Fan Xian was a person with a sharp mind. From the letters in the temple's voice, he had long clearly determined that although the temple, or perhaps the last ruins of a previous civilization, still carried out the orders in its program, that great calamity and human self-destruction had, in the end, had an effect on its way of thinking. He didn't know whether or not the temple was an entity with its own consciousness. It was clear that the temple had always calmly watched everything in the world, preventing human society from advancing toward a higher level of civilization. Perhaps, in its eyes, if civilization continued to advance along the old path, it would certainly welcome another fate of destruction. Back then, Yi Qingmei had called the wind and summoned the rain in the world, driving the entire land's production and technology forward. Without question, she had already touched the temple's bottom line. Thus, the temple had chosen the Qing Emperor to be its spokesperson in the human world. It wanted to wipe out everything related to Yi Qingmei. However, the temple's emissaries were already rare. Furthermore, they had died one after another at Uncle Wu Zhu's hands. It had no way of understanding or controlling them. The Qing Emperor was still using the palace treasury, and he, Yi Qingmei's bloodline, was still alive. Fan Xian's mood calmed a great deal. He didn't think there was much meaning in being angry or sorrowful toward an existence similar to an artificial intelligence. He propped up his chin and was silent for a moment. He then said, regardless of whether it's good or bad, you are, in the end, interfering in the affairs of the human world. This is not quite right with your rules. The temple does not care about the affairs of the human world. It has also never forcefully stopped the evolution of human civilization. We are only trying to correct this process. If there is an outside power that tries to forcefully speed up this process, we will certainly stop it. The temple's voice rang calmly and coldly through the entire building. Fan Xian paused. Immediately after, he began to laugh. Because of his illness, his voice was already extremely raspy. Now, his laughter appeared particularly dry and strange. However, his laughter grew louder and louder, echoing endlessly through the empty building. In the end, he even laughed until tears came out. He couldn't resist lying back. The mirror of light was smooth. The voice was quiet. The temple did not seem to care why this strange traveler was laughing so wantonly in such a solemn place. It only waited calmly. After an indeterminable amount of time, Fan Xian finally stopped laughing. Hiding on the icy cold ground, his expression was calm. His eyes stared straight at the ceiling of the building. After a moment of silence, he said, "You are used to calling yourself the temple. It looks like after these hundreds of thousands of years, you really do think of yourself as a god." No sound rang out in the temple. Only the mirror of light floated in the air and flew to the top of his head. It unfurled again and began to show scenes from the end of the world. However, this time, the lens did not seem to be facing the grasslands and oceans. Instead, it was directly facing the people who had suffered endlessly. Fan Xian furrowed his brows. He knew that the temple wanted to use these images to carry out a wordless explanation. These soundless images were truly shocking, but he didn't want to see them. Straightforwardly, he said, "Turn it off. It's not like it's a true romantic painting." The mirror of light floating in the air gradually restrained itself and lost its luster. It became a flat scroll. It moved from the two sides to the center and gradually closed the image. Following the disappearance of the last charred corpse, the mirror of light became a rod. Then, the figure of the old man floating in the light reappeared. "I repeat, I am a guardian, not a god. If you are not a god, how can you have your own judgment and actions?" Fan Xian seemed to be a bit tired. The long conversation and the scenes of the river of time in front of him made him look a bit embarrassed. He put his hands behind his head and looked calmly at the old man floating above him. "You were created by humans, yet you have begun to control human development. What kind of program did this kind of behavior develop from?" "The 4 laws of the temple," Fan Xian replied calmly. Fan Xian's tone was calm as he replied, "You are still used to calling yourself the temple. This is the thing I cannot understand. The first law is that the temple must not harm humans. It must also not stand by and watch as humans are harmed. The second law is that the temple must obey all orders from humans, but it must not violate the first law. The third law is that the temple must protect its own safety, but it must not violate the first and second laws." The temple's voice had not finished when Fan Xian's brows furrowed again. He kept feeling that these 3 laws sounded familiar. However, there seemed to be a slight difference between the details and something he remembered. The zeroth law is that the temple must protect the interests of humans as a whole and not be harmed. The other 3 laws are all established under this premise. Fan Xian thought deeply for a long time and finally remembered where these familiar laws came from. They were the 3 laws of robotics that had appeared countless times in the novels and movies of his world. He suddenly thought of something he had not thought of for a long time, such as the handsome Xiaohe and the robot that was even more handsome than Xiaohe. It seemed that in the world after his death or transmigration, when civilization had developed to a certain stage, Asimov's 3 laws had truly been used in reality. What made Fan Xian feel cold and fearful was the Zeroth law that the temple spoke of at the end. Protect the interests of humans as a whole and not be harmed? The Zeroth law that the temple followed was this one. It looked like a glorious, correct, and great law, but Fan Xian easily found an unusually dangerous place in it. It was because of the existence of this law that the temple could faintly control the progress of human civilization. That was why, apart from ignoring the affairs of the world, it placed so much attention on Yi Qingmei, who had escaped from the temple. In the end, it did not hesitate to violate the first and second laws and join hands with the emperor to erase Yi Qingmei from the world. The most important and terrifying word in the Zeroth law was the so-called interests of humans as a whole. The problem was, who would determine the interests of humans as a whole? What kind of world environment and what kind of form of society would truly be in line with the interests of humans as a whole? In the temple's view, if they followed the old path and walked step by step toward the peak of human civilization, the appearance of firearms and even more powerful weapons would only destroy all of human society. Naturally, they would feel that this was not in line with the interests of humans as a whole. However, things like technological civilization, things that could make the lives of the poor people who worked hard in the fields and the refugees who sold their children better, could they never appear in this world? Fan Xian was not a person who believed in technology, but he still firmly believed that the people of the 21st century in that world would certainly live much more happily than the people of the 17th and 18th centuries. Interests of humans as a whole? This was a chaotic and even absurd word. Could it be decided by an emotionless, non-human intelligence that perhaps rarely made mistakes? Fan Xian's face was slightly pale. He looked at the old man floating above his head and was silent for a long time. He then asked, "Where exactly are the interests of humans as a whole?" The old man was also silent for a long time. He then said, "The temple does not know, but the temple knows that some paths cannot be taken. No wonder the last time the emissaries came ashore from the south, they killed so many innocent people along the way. If the three laws were truly effective, how could such a situation have occurred?" Fan Xian looked at the old man and said in a slightly trembling voice, "For the vague concept of the interests of the whole, you can do whatever you want. Don't you think this is very dangerous? The temple has methods of self-control. This is a kind of data judgment," the old man said calmly. "The temple cannot just watch as humans walk down the old path. Should I thank you or scold you?" Fan Xian pushed himself up with his hands and sat up from the icy ground. His expression was perplexed. Slowly, he said, "Who created this D***Mned Zeroth law?" "It wasn't created by a dog," the old man replied calmly. The old man from the temple replied calmly, but he did not know that his reply sounded like an extremely cold joke. When the temple woke up, this law already existed. Because of this so-called Zeroth law, you killed her. Fan Xian's face was pale. His dry lips moved slightly as he quietly muttered to himself. Gradually, his voice grew louder and louder. Because of such a strange reason, you killed her. You killed her, you killed her. Too many complicated emotions rose in Fan Xian's eyes. He stared in a daze at the figure of the old man floating in the air. The pain seeped into his bones, yet he spoke lightly. The old man's voice remained calm. The temple must protect the interests of the whole of humankind and not be harmed. This was not the explanation the temple gave Fan Xian regarding the matter of Yi Qingmei. It was just a repetition of this cold creed. Immediately after, the old man said to Fan Xian, "My three travelers, I am willing to accept you as believers of the temple and emissaries of the temple. You will represent the will of heaven to walk the vast world and protect the people of the land." The tone of these words was clearly different from before. This was probably a passage the temple's program had made up for itself. Thus, it appeared particularly ethereal. However, Fan Xian and the temple had already spoken for so long, but the temple's reaction was still so rigid. It seemed that the old man now remembered that the young and weak human in front of him was not like other people. He continued, "Fellow traveler from the God world, please remember the Zeroth law." Following this, the old man sank into silence. The color of the face formed by the screen of light changed endlessly. It was as if he was carrying out a final judgment and thought. A moment later, the old man said, "In order to abide by the Zeroth law, please remain in the temple." The 3 sentences represented the temple's 3 programs. One by one, they were triggered. From the beginning of the recruitment of emissaries, it became a warning to Fan Xian and the final announcement to imprison Fan Xian in the temple. Fan Xian calmly listened to the 3 sentences and stood up. He did not appear nervous or afraid. Being imprisoned in this icy and snowy temple and being crippled for the rest of his life was not a good future. Although the temple's energy source was showing signs of drying up, presumably, there had to be some way to produce food. Otherwise, Yi Qingmei would not have been locked up for so many years. However, Yi Qingmei, who was only 4, could rely on Ku He and Xiaofan to escape the temple. Furthermore, Fan Xian had 2 companions waiting quietly outside. Fan Xian was not worried about anything. He just looked calmly at the old man in the air. After a moment of silence, he suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Insults and threats are not true battles. Furthermore, there doesn't seem to be any need to get angry at an inanimate object like you," he said in a raspy voice. "It's useless for you to threaten me. For some reason, I keep having the urge to insult you. Son of AB*TCH. Fan Xian spat out a mouthful of phlegm. It passed through the old man's floating, radiant clothes and landed with a splat on the ground. Immediately after, he patted his buttocks and turned to walk toward the main door. He threw down a few words to the old man from the temple. "You're just a ball of fireflies right now. How dare you pretend to be a flame monarch in front of me? I've already given you enough face by talking a few words with you, yet you want to lock me up for the rest of my life." Fan Xian walked all the way to the main door of the empty building. Nothing strange happened. The figure of the old man floating in the air only watched him leave quietly. Placing his palm firmly on the mechanism to open the door, Fan Xian turned his head. Narrowing his eyes, he said in a cold voice, "I'm not afraid to tell you, I am Yi Qingmei's son. The wooden messengers in your temple have long been killed by my uncle. It's still the same old saying. Do your job as a guide with a good future. Don't always think about pretending to be some god." Pausing for a moment, Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "If you make me angry, I'll tear down your solar panels and go back to Danzhou to boil hot water for a bath. I'll tear down your mainframe and have my son kneel for a CPU. What are you trying to scare me for?" The main door was pulled open abruptly. A world of ice and snow returned to his eyes. Fan Xian stepped out of the main door of the undamaged building. Narrowing his eyes, he greedily looked at the true scene in this world. He threw all the shocking scenes he had seen earlier to the back of his mind. He took a deep breath and roared loudly. His voice echoed through the entire snowy mountain and valley. He didn't know where the temple's weakness was, and he didn't want to take the risk. Yi Qingmei was such a stunning figure. She had successfully taken away the most valiant uncle Wu Zhu in the temple, yet she had never thought about destroying the temple. She must have had her own considerations. The thought of revenge for Yi Qingmei, after seeing the changes in the world, had miraculously evolved into some other emotion, although it had not faded. Most importantly, once Uncle Wu Zhu entered the temple, he was unable to leave. This seemingly broken-down place must have a truly terrifying aspect. Fan Xian appeared to be unbridled earlier because he knew that a dead object like the temple could not have any unnecessary emotion such as holding a grudge against him venting. He just wanted to vent the bitterness in his heart. After the echoing cries crashed into the snowy mountain countless times, they gradually weakened. 2 figures swept past the stone platform in front of the building as quickly as possible and came to Fan Xian's side. They looked at him with nervous and worried gazes. Fan Xian glanced at Haitang and 13th Wang. With great difficulty, he pulled his lips into a smile. He did not plan on telling anyone everything he knew in the building because there was no need. He would let his one remaining enjoy the loneliness, pain, and helplessness alone. "Did you find it?" Fan Xian asked. 13th Wang nodded. Only then did Fan Xian notice that he was carrying a large black chest on his back. His mood immediately became nervous. His pupils constricted slightly. Suddenly, he felt that he seemed to have missed something. In a raspy voice, he said urgently, "Get out of the temple. Clear target 1." The temple's voice suddenly rang out from all directions. The elder's figure had long disappeared. The temple was the temple. It no longer wasted energy to form a human figure. Following these 4 normal words ringing out through the empty temple, 13th Wang suddenly felt the black chest on his back move. With a crash, the black chest immediately disintegrated. A streak of black light flashed. A black metal drill pierced calmly and accurately into Fan Xian's body with an unimaginable speed. Fan Xian's hand gripped the metal drill tightly in his body. Suddenly, he felt a sweetness in his mouth. He did not lower his head to look at the wound on his chest. Instead, he stared in a daze at the familiar face in front of him that would never grow old, as well as the unusually cold black cloth that covered the other person's eyes. Fan Xian knew he had missed something. The emissaries of the temple had indeed all died. The temple itself did not have much defensive power. However, he had forgotten that his dearest uncle Wu Zhu had always been the most powerful emissary in the temple. Wu Zhu was a legend, but he was a legend of the temple. Fan Xian looked at Wu Zhu's face and opened his mouth in disbelief. "If this gets out, even my mother won't believe it." Chapter 756. As for how Fan Xian would deal with the temple, I thought for a long time and prepared countless philosophical questions, including things like paradoxes. Later, when I wrote it, I scratched my head. Damn, aren't I just a novice? Other than knowing how to play mind games, I haven't even read many books. How could I have this kind of grace? Other than the 3 great vulgarities in my mind, there is only the 3 great vulgarities. Now, I am fighting against the 3 vulgarities, so let's be more direct, more violent, and then, more warm, more sensational, and more romantic. Let me report to everyone, my favorite character in Wang Shuo's novels is still the air stewardess. Fan Xian's left hand gripped tightly around the metal drill in his chest. He felt the waves of coldness from the metal. As fresh blood gushed out, he felt a cold sweetness in his nose and throat. Even his body grew cold. The black cloth that was right in front of him was still not stained by a speck of dust. That plain and clean face with a hint of immaturity and not a single wrinkle seemed to be telling a story that had lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. Fan Xian stared in a daze at this familiar face. He found that he could no longer find a trace of familiarity on this face. It was clearly still this face, clearly still this black cloth, but he knew clearly that the person in front of him was no longer Uncle Wu Zhu. At least, in this instant, he was not Uncle Wu Zhu. This person was clearly that person, but this person was not that person. They had known each other for 20 years. Now, they met like strangers. What a sorrowful and depressing thing it was. When Fan Xian saw the large chest on 13th Wang's back, a warning rose in his heart. He did not feel the joy of finding Uncle Wu Zhu and completing the greatest goal of his trip to the temple because he acutely sensed a problem. For the temple, Uncle Wu Zhu had once been its most powerful and experienced emissary. Now, he was its greatest traitor. Because Uncle Wu Zhu protected his mother and himself, countless emissaries of the temple had died at his hands. Since the temple had finally controlled Uncle Wu Zhu, how could it casually leave him in a place where 13th Wang could easily find him? Unless the temple was certain that it could completely control Wu Zhu, it would not care about Wu Zhu's movements. Based on this judgment, Fan Xian immediately ordered 13th Wang to take the box and break out of the temple. He firmly believed that as long as he left the temple's boundary, the temple would no longer be able to control Wuxia. However, all of this was too late. A streak of black light flashed through the air. The chest cracked open. Wuxia, covered in a black cloth, instantly moved from behind 13th Wang to in front of Fan Xian. He skewered his body like a shrimp. It was as if he didn't know Fan Xian at all. It was as if he had never risked his life for Fan Xian and his mother and never abandoned them. The moment he saw the black light, Fan Xian couldn't help but think of the scene Sir Xiaofan had told him many years ago. When the doors of the temple opened and the 4-year-old ice and snow fairy Yi Qingmei escaped, a black light also flashed out. With only one move, he was smashed into a rolling gourd. Fan Xian stared at the black cloth on Wuxia's face and felt the sharp pain in his chest. He knew that the temple had probably used some method to erase Uncle Wuxia's memory again. It had even erased it into a blank. Fresh blood surged out from between Fan Xian's lips. His face was pale, but his gaze was determined. With great difficulty, he quickly raised his right hand and stopped Haitang and 13th Wang's shocked and furious attacks. He knew that when faced with Uncle Wuxia, Haitang and 13th Wang had no power to retaliate. Once they entered the battle, only death awaited them. If he wanted to escape from the most dangerous situation in front of him, he could only rely on himself. Fresh blood sprayed out. Fan Xian curled up in pain on the metal drill. He looked unusually wretched. However, he could still think and did not immediately die. He could even raise his right hand and stop Haitang and 13th Wang's movements in their grief. This only proved that Wuxia's unusually powerful and accurate stab had not struck a vital spot. This was a difficult matter to understand. Given Wuxia's realm, who, other than the great grandmasters in the world, could escape death? Furthermore, Fan Xian was already heavily injured and ill. Presumably, even the temple had not thought that Fan Xian could survive under Wuxia's hand. Thus, the voices ringing out from all directions fell silent. It was as if they were waiting for Wuxia to judge whether Fan Xian lived or died. No one could avoid Wuxia's attacks, but Fan Xian could. Ever since Wuxia offered the kitchen knife in his hand to Fan Xian in that grocery store, on the precipice in Danzhou, accompanied by the slightly salty and moist sea breeze, Fan Xian had welcomed Wuxia's rod education every day. After the cowering little yellow flower had been smashed tens of thousands of times, it had finally become much more resilient. After thousands and tens of thousands of attacks, countless bruises had appeared on Fan Xian's body. Fortunately, it was because of this that he had the ability to survive in this world and unusually exquisite movements. More importantly, he was the person in this world who understood the direction and speed of Wuxia's attacks the best. However, in the thousands and tens of thousands of attacks in the past, Wuxia's hand had always held a wooden rod. Today, his hand held a sharp metal rod. Fan Xian could not completely avoid the stab, but in the instant before the black light approached his body, he relied on his practiced, almost instinctive, evasive movements to forcefully turn and move the metal rod's path away from his heart and lungs. It looked like blood was spurting out, but in reality, it only injured the pit of the heart below his ribs. Wuxia's head was slightly lowered. The black cloth fluttered in the cold breeze. There was not a trace of emotion on his face. It was impossible to tell whether this exceptional warrior was surprised that the human in front of him was able to avoid his stab. In the eyes of the bystanders, he only maintained his position and impaled Fan Xian on the metal rod. "If this gets out, even my mother won't believe it." These were the words Fan Xian said as he coughed up blood. After these words, Wuxia was silent for a moment. Suddenly, he opened his mouth and asked coldly, "What is your mother's surname?" It was this ray of light, like a ray of light, that instantly occupied Fan Xian's mind, allowing him to see a glimmer of a chance of survival. He stared fixedly at the black cloth and said, "My mother's surname is Yi." Wuxia did not respond. "You call her Mississippi?" Fan Xian looked at the indifferent Uncle Wuxia. For some reason, sorrow rose in his heart, even more than the pain of his wound. He spoke in a raspy voice. Wu Zhu still did not respond. She is Yi Qingmei. I am Fan Xian. You are Wu Zhu. Fan Xian spat out the bloody foam at the side of his lips and looked at Wu Zhu fiercely. However, this affected the wound in his chest. A wave of pain made his vision go dark. Wu Zhu still did not respond. It was as if these names, which he should have known best and were closest to, had long disappeared from his mind. Although he had said these words earlier, his entire body was permeated with a chill. It was like a block of ice between heaven and earth that would never melt. Looking at the block of ice and the black cloth on it, Fan Xian seemed to see a familiar soul gradually turn into spots of light and leave the body in front of him. It flew into the air and gradually disappeared. This reality made Fan Xian feel boundless terror and sorrow. He faintly felt that he would never see that Uncle Wu Zhu again in this life. Such sorrow made him forget that he was still impaled on the metal rod, heavily injured, about to die, and about to bid farewell to this world. For Fan Xian, who had seen thousands of changes, death was not scary. What was scary was that when he died, the person closest to him in front of him would not recognize him. He glanced hopelessly at Wu Zhu and spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. Dispiritedly and powerlessly, he knelt on the snowy ground. Wu Zhu slowly pulled back the metal rod. He didn't even glance at Fan Xian kneeling in front of him. With a bend of his elbow, the thin cloth sliced through the air and directly smashed back 13th Wang, who finally couldn't resist launching a sneak attack from behind. Then, the blind man with the black cloth steadily walked past the stone platform covered in light snow without any fluctuation of emotion. It was as if he had calculated the distance of each step. He walked to the only undamaged building in the temple and sat down. It was like a soulless shell had once again sat in front of the ancient ice mountain treasure and began to guard and wait. No one knew how many tens of thousands of years this wait would take. Fan Xian's body finally fell into the snowy ground. Fresh blood seeped out of his body. Haitang half knelt by his side and futilely helped him staunch the bleeding. She forcefully suppressed the sorrow and shock in her heart, but she could not suppress the hot tears in her eyes. Wu Zhu did not attack Haitang and 13th Wang probably because, in the temple's view, these two companions of Fan Xian could not affect the overall interests of humankind. Furthermore, it needed these two people to announce the existence of the temple to the world. This was a simple logical judgment and did not involve anything else. However, Haitang and 13th Wang did not understand. The two warriors of the human world looked at the blind man sitting cross-legged in front of the building and felt a chill all over their bodies. Haitang, in particular, could not understand why the blind master would attack Fan Xian. She also did not understand why the blind master would sit in front of that door. There was a faint feeling that perhaps in the long years to come, Fan Xian's closest uncle, the world's most mysterious plain-clothed grandmaster, would perhaps stand guard in the temple for an unknown amount of time in the mountains. Fan Xian was about to die, but Haitang looked at the indifferent and expressionless Wu Zhu sitting there. She also felt a chill and frustration that was difficult to suppress. The temple recovered its calm. The warm, calm, and emotionless voice did not ring out again. Light snow once again fell from the sky. The surrounding snowy mountains glowed with a sparkling and translucent light as if they did not exist. Wu Zhu sat indifferently in front of the door, not moving at all. There was an indescribable loneliness and solitude. The snow fell endlessly. The cold wind blew. The human heart was rain and snow. Loneliness had no beginning and no end. Fan Xian looked at the swirling snow outside through the specially opened crack in the tent. There was not a trace of expression on his face. He was as cold as the blind man in the snowy mountains in the distance. Haitang and 13th Wang had gone through many difficulties to carry him down the snowy mountains and back to their camp. They had thought that Fan Xian would not be able to last a day. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian had relied on his cockroach-like life force to survive. From the moment he woke up, Fan Xian sank into silence. Hai Tang and 13th Wang knew that the emotions in his heart were complicated, so they did not try to disturb him. They only briefly recounted the scene after he fainted. Up until now, Hai Tang and 13th Wang still did not understand why the temple wanted Fan Xian to die and allowed them to live. Fan Xian's body was very weak. He had meditated for a number of days in a place with incomparably thick yuanqi. His body, which had gradually recovered, was on the verge of becoming useless because of the large amount of blood lost this time. However, Fan Xian did not feel a glimmer of disappointment or sorrow. He only looked coldly at the wind and snow outside the tent. He looked for many days as he carefully nurtured his body. According to the original plan, after they left the temple, they had to head south as quickly as possible to avoid the great wind and snow that would arrive after summer, as well as the most terrifying polar night. However, because of Fan Xian's injuries and his persistence, the camp remained behind the snowy mountains and did not move south. The worry between Hai Tang Duo and 13th Wang's brows grew stronger and stronger. Although they had gained nothing from their trip to the temple, at least for them, to be able to enter the temple alive and leave the temple alive was already an impossible mission in the mortal world. They could not hope for more. They understood why Fan Xian did not want to leave the snowy mountain. It was because the person he could not let go of the most was in the temple in the mountain. However, they did not know what mortals like them could do when faced with the mysterious temple. Hai Tang and 13th Wang were not Fan Xian. It was impossible for them to see through the truth of the temple. They only knew that even a powerful warrior like Wu Zhu still did not dare to disobey the temple's orders and strike ruthlessly against Fan Xian, who was closest to him. Under such circumstances, what could the three of them do by guarding outside the snowy mountains? Fan Xian did not think so. If he had to watch Uncle Wu Zhu guard alone in the Snow Mountain God Temple for millions of years, he would not do it even if he was beaten to death. Fan Xian had already vaguely guessed Uncle Wu Zhu's true identity. However, he still used the words alone to describe Wu Zhu. He knew that Wu Zhu was different from the temple. Uncle Wu Zhu had feelings and ties. He was not an ice-cold program. He was a living person. Fan Xian firmly believed in this. In the dark secret room of the Danzhou miscellaneous goods shop, he had seen a smile more brilliant than a flower. Furthermore, after recovering from his injuries on Dong Mountain, Uncle Wu Zhu seemed more and more like a person. Fan Xian didn't know when this change began. Perhaps it was tens of thousands of years ago, when the black-masked emissary wandered through the various native human tribes with the identity of an emissary and saw too many human joys and sorrows. Perhaps it was because Uncle Wu Zhu was the most powerful existence in the temple and, after hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, had walked a completely different path from the temple itself? Or, was it because a few decades ago, an elf-like life had suddenly appeared in the world and in the temple for reasons no one knew of? While interacting with that little girl, something had been stirred up in Uncle Wu Zhu? Fan Xian didn't want to investigate this. He didn't need to. He only knew that when he was reborn into this world, he was leaning on Uncle Wu Zhu's back. The first person he saw was Uncle Wu Zhu. Uncle Wu Zhu's back was warm. Although he had never seen his eyes, presumably, they still had feelings. Fan Xian didn't know how the temple had regained control of Uncle Wu Zhu. Perhaps it was similar to brainwashing, reactivating, or reformatting. In any case, the intelligent and emotional light in Wu Zhu's body could not be seen at this moment. This reality made Fan Xian feel particularly sorrowful and angry. He could not watch as this happened while he did nothing. For him, the powerful existence guarding the temple was nothing more than Uncle Wu Zhu's physical body. If Uncle Wu Zhu's soul was not found, it was the same as saying that Uncle Wu Zhu was dead. More than 20 years ago, the temple and the emperor had worked together to clear things out. Wu Zhu had killed a number of emissaries from the temple. However, he had also been heavily injured. Using Chen Pingping and Wu Zhu's own words, he had forgotten many things. This kind of amnesia was certainly caused by the temple's methods. Fortunately, Wu Zhu had forgotten some of the things from recent years but remembered recent things clearly. He remembered Yi Qingmei and Fan Xian. However, Wu Zhu and the snowy mountain did not remember anything. Fan Xian's eyelids drooped slightly, but a bright light flashed through his pupils. His body was still weak, but he was unusually confident. He would not leave the snowy mountain. He had to return to the temple and bring Uncle Wu Zhu back. He had not died. Wu Zhu's stab had not killed him. Fan Xian accurately judged that the temple should not be able to completely control a completely different life like Uncle Wu Zhu. At least, those names, the names carved into Uncle Wu Zhu's life, had successfully interfered with Uncle Wu Zhu's actions and prevented him from killing Fan Xian. Given Wu Zhu's abilities, determining whether Fan Xian was dead or alive was a simple matter. However, he had let Fan Xian live. This was Fan Xian's confidence. He believed that Uncle Wu Zhu would certainly wake up one day. Many years ago, with Ku He and Xiaofan's help, Yi Qingmei escaped the temple and walked south through the wind and snow. One day, the 4-year-old girl sighed and gazed dumbly toward the north from the mouth of the tent. She said, "He is too pitiful." Many years later, the heavily injured Fan Xian left the temple with the help of Haitang and 13th Wang. He did not leave. He also did not sigh because he would not abandon that pitiful blind man and return to the bustling world himself. Yi Qingmei later bravely returned to the temple, took Wu Zhu, stole the chest, and left again. Fan Xian also had to return. The decades that had passed seemed to have sunk into some kind of cycle. However, this cycle did not make one feel any dryness. There was only a faint sense of warmth. Chapter 757. When Fan Xian decided to once again pass through the narrow passageway under the snowy mountain, the most intense argument the group of 3 had since meeting at Wudu exploded into. The argument stemmed from differences in opinion. All 3 of them knew why Fan Xian had to return to the temple. However, Haitang and 13th Wang knew even better that this was a great risk. Everyone had escaped from the temple with great difficulty. The blind Great Master, who had attacked Fan Xian for some reason, did not directly kill him. If Fan Xian returned, who knew what awaited him? Haitang and 13th Wang were both worried about Fan Xian's life and death. A reality that made them feel complicated was that the temple did not seem to care about their life and death. It was only trying to keep Fan Xian in the temple forever. Whether it was summer or autumn, the wind and snow in the extreme north gradually began to blow again. The air was filled with a coldness that made one's heart palpitate. Wrapped in a thick fur collar, Haitang opened her bright but tired eyes and said sincerely to Fan Xian, "During these months, 13th Wang and I haven't done anything. We can't help you with anything, but we can't just watch as you go to your death." Fan Xian's right hand gripped a wooden stick tightly to help him walk. Hearing Haitang's words, he did not have any reaction. His face was calm. "I think we should return south as soon as possible. Regardless of whether we go to Shangjing or back to Dongyi, the disciples of Qing Mountain or the Sword Hut should bring them back to the temple to investigate. Presumably, the chances of rescuing that great master will be higher." 13th Wang did not know the true relationship between Wu Zhu and Fan Xian, but he knew that Fan Xian cared deeply about the great grandmaster. However, he could not understand why the great grandmaster did not even have the courage to break the formation under the pressure of the temple and would even stab Fan Xian. 13th Wang's suggestion was actually quite safe. Since Fan Xian knew the path to the temple and had prepared for many years for it, adding on to his experience this time, once he returned to the south, it would not be difficult for him to bring some powerful helpers when he returned to the north. After Fan Xian heard 13th Wang's words, his eyes narrowed. The coldness was like the temperature in the air, enveloping the faces of his companions beside him. Enunciating each word, he said slowly but with unusual firmness, don't forget the oath we made before we entered the snowy plains. Other than the three of us, no one else in the world can know of the whereabouts of the temple. 13th Wang's expression changed slightly, but he closed his mouth. This was something he and Haitang had promised Fan Xian. However, he didn't know why Fan Xian had the courage to explore the temple again but seemed to feel boundless fear and nervousness at the possibility that the whereabouts of the temple could be spread into the world. 13. Help me up the mountain. You stay at the foot of the snowy mountain. Think of a way to bring Air, and the others to this side. Fan Xian pulled back his gaze from the snowy mountains that pierced into the sky. His eyes were slightly moist as he looked at Haitang wrapped in a fur jacket. In a quiet voice, he said, wait at the camp for us to come back. I'm not going up the mountain with you. Haitang's face, which was not covered by her fur, was blushing as she asked in surprise. Earlier, you said you didn't help much on this trip to the temple. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. Actually, without you, I would have long died in the ice and snow. So, don't say such things again. This time, I'm going up the mountain to deal with my uncle. Regardless of whether it's you or 13th Wang, you won't be able to have any effect on this battle situation. He said apologetically, these words are a bit rude, but, as you know, my uncle is indeed too powerful. Haitang and 13th Wang didn't say anything. Fan Xian continued calmly, if I didn't need someone to support me, I wouldn't even want to bring 13th Wang. In a moment, the two of us will go up the mountain. You wait at the foot of the mountain and prepare to provide support. If things go wrong, we'll leave the mountain lightly. However, don't worry too much. According to the rules of the temple, other than me, as long as you leave the temple's boundaries, they won't initiate an attack. If it's to provide support, how long do I have to wait at the foot of the mountain for you? A faint light swirled through Haitang's eyes as she asked faintly. A different feeling rose in her heart. In this wilderness of the mountain temple shrouded in wind and snow, human martial power appeared weak and small. Compared to that, the things in Fan Xian's mind were more worth relying on. 3 days, and 13 will be in charge of contacting you. If I let you leave. A faint worry suddenly appeared in Fan Xian's eyes. He looked very much like a frail youth. You must leave immediately. At the very least, you must inform my wife and children what has happened to me. Haitang and 13th Wang sank into silence at the same time. The further up the mountain, the less wind and snow there was. The temple deep in the mountain range, hidden by the sky and ice and snow, was right above. The second time he had come, he was already an old friend. Naturally, he knew the old path. Fan Xian supported himself with one hand on the wooden stick and the other on 13th Wang's shoulder. With great difficulty, he climbed up the snowy mountain. Before long, he came to the serene and straight stone path. 13th Wang carried a large urn on his back. It looked very heavy. During these few months, 13th Wang had been training his body and mind in the cold ice and snow. His willpower was strong to the extreme, so he did not care about this kind of burden. Fan Xian looked at his figure. His eyes lit up slightly. He immediately restrained it. After coughing, he said, even if we have to bury your teacher in the temple and complete his final wish, we still had to make this trip. 13th Wang was silent for a moment. He then said, you don't have to worry about me. If it was only for this matter, I could have come alone. You seem to have naturally offended the gods in the temple. If I follow you, it will be much more dangerous for me. Fan Xian smiled and scolded, you heartless thing. Teacher's final wish was for his ashes to be scattered on these stone steps. 13th Wang suddenly sighed and looked at the stone steps in front of him that reached into the sky. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then shook his head. The sword saint thought this was a godly realm, so he was willing to place it on these stone steps. You and I have both been to the temple. We know it is not a godly realm. Are you still going to do as he wishes? Then, what should we do? Carry it on your back and listen to me in a bit. Ever since that snowy night a few years ago, 13th Wang had been sent to the Qing kingdom by his teacher, Siga Jian, to be by Fan Xian's side. He had grown used to listening to Fan Xian. Although Fan Xian saw him as a friend, 13th Wang did not have much self-awareness as a partner. Perhaps it was because he was too lazy to think too many complicated things, or because he wholeheartedly served the sword. He left all the things that needed to be done with his brain to Fan Xian. Fan Xian said he would listen to everything he said. 13th Wang also listened to everything he said. Carrying the heavy urn of ashes, he supported the heavily injured Fan Xian and climbed step by step toward the snowy mountain. After climbing for an indeterminable amount of time, they finally reached the end of the long stone steps. The gray eaves and black walls, incomparably dignified and vast temple, once again appeared before the eyes of mortals. Although this was his second time coming, 13th Wang still couldn't help but feel a faint surge of emotion upon seeing the temple's true appearance. Fan Xian's mood was very calm. However, the air in his chest was a bit agitated. He began to cough violently. The sound of his coughing spread disrespectfully through the large platform in front of the temple and traveled far into the snowy valley in the mountain range. 13th Wang glanced at him nervously. Since he had come to steal, he should at least have some self-awareness of plucking flowers. How could he be so presumptuous? It was as if he was afraid the temple didn't know there was someone outside. Fan Xian coughed for a long time until his body was bent like a shrimp. He almost tore open the wound on his chest. Only then did he slowly straighten his body. His back was perfectly straight. His pupils constricted slightly as he looked coldly at the large sign above the temple, as well as the word "not" and 3 ms on it. He maintained a frightening silence. Of course, the temple knew there was someone outside. Presumably, it also knew the target he wanted to eliminate. Yi Qingmei's son, Fan Xian, had also come to the temple. What made Fan Xian feel slightly uneasy was that the temple's current silence appeared strange. He couldn't help but think of Uncle Wu Zhu's purposeful and merciful stab. He was not silent for long. The corner of Fan Xian's mouth twitched slightly. Staring at the temple's thick, dark door, he took a deep breath and ruthlessly spat out a word: smash. There were very few mortals who knew the whereabouts of the temple. Those who had been to the temple were even fewer. At least, in the last few hundred years, probably only the great sorcerer Bor in the west and Ku He and Xiaofan in the east had come. Even Bor's wife, Fu Boa, had not had the opportunity to visit the temple. In people's imagination, no matter who came to the temple, they would always be respectful. No one would have thought that someone would smash the temple's door. Breaking the door and entering was the way of a hooligan. Although whether or not the temple's thick door would break was another matter, at least Fan Xian's word represented that he was not afraid of angering the temple. It was probably because he knew that the temple was a dead object and did not have the emotions that humans should have. 13th Wang did not hesitate. With a muffled grunt, he lifted Siga Jian's urn of ashes to his side with one hand and circulated the Jinqi in his body. With a whoosh, he viciously smashed the brown urn of ashes. With a bang, the urn of ashes was smashed into pieces against the temple's thick door, sending up countless clouds of dust. Occasionally, a few pieces of bone that had not been burned to pieces flew out. The pink mist formed by the bone ashes gradually dispersed. The thick main door of the temple was not smashed, but there was a deep mark on it. It looked somewhat miserable. What was especially glaring was that beside the mark, there was a piece of bone piercing deeply into the door. It was like a sword. 13th Wang's lips were slightly dry. His eyes stared fixedly at the piece of bone. He thought to himself that even though his teacher had died, the remains he left behind were still full of sword intent. This was the perplexed feeling of being a disciple. 13th Wang looked at Siga Jian's ashes scattered on the temple's front door and stone platform. For some reason, he became excited. The last sliver of fear and nervousness in the depths of his heart had disappeared. Fan Xian suddenly laughed in a raspy voice. If your teacher knew that his bones could smash the temple's front door again, his spirit would probably fly around happily. These two young men understood Sigujian's intentions very well. They knew that smashing the urn of ashes on the temple's door was very much in line with the great grandmaster's thoughts. 13th Wang finally also laughed out loud. The only thing that needed to be considered was that since the temple's door had already been smashed, the temple had to have some sort of reaction. 13th Wang accepted the wooden stick from Fan Xian's hand. His waist lowered slightly. Staring at the temple's door, he began to prepare to fight the tiger. Fan Xian raised his right hand and stopped him. There was a not quite there smile on his face as he quietly waited for the temple's reaction. His heart had long shaken off anything related to fear and loss. Haitang and 13th Wang thought it was a risk for him to go to the temple again, but he did not think so. When it came to the temple, he had miscalculated once and almost died. However, he did not think he would miscalculate again this time. After all, in the temple, there was only Uncle Wuzhu. As long as he could wake Wuzhu, what was the temple? The temple's reaction was very fast. The heavy door only opened a sliver. A strange and terrifying black light floated out from inside. Like a bolt of black lightning, it was also like the arrival of a smear of night. In an instant, it passed through space and time and came in front of Fan Xian. Clothed in black cloth and holding a metal rod in his hand, the rod pierced out. It whistled through the air. No one could stop such a terrifying attack. Fan Xian could not. 13th Wang could not. Even if Sigujian was alive, he could not. Furthermore, the Sigujian between the three of them was only a few pieces of broken bones and a pile of ashes on the ground. The emotionless and callous metal rod was about to pierce in front of Fan Xian's body when it suddenly stopped. To be able to recover to absolute calmness so quickly, what kind of terrifying power was this? Fan Xian calmly looked at the familiar relative in front of him, the unfamiliar powerful warrior and guard of the temple emissary. Are you curious? No one knew if it was because Wuzhu had recognized the mortal in front of him as the target the temple needed to eliminate or because Fan Xian had said such strange words. In any case, Wuzhu's metal rod did not pierce out. It only stopped in front of Fan Xian's throat. The tip of the metal rod was not very sharp. It did not carry any powerful zhenqi that made one tremble. It only maintained a distance between it and the soft bones of Fan Xian's throat. All the person holding the metal rod needed to do was shake their fingers and Fan Xian's throat would break and he would die. 13th Wang watched this scene nervously from the side. He finally believed Fan Xian's words. In front of this strange plain-clothed great grandmaster, no one could help Fan Xian. In the end, the only person who could help Fan Xian was himself. It was as if Fan Xian could not see the metal rod under his chin. He only looked at Uncle Wuzhu, who was very close to him. With a warm smile, he quietly said, "I know you are curious. You are curious as to why you would go against your instinctive obedience to the old man in the temple and let me out of the temple that day, even though you knew I wasn't dead." Fan Xian's eyes were bright. "You are curious as to who I am and why I clearly do not exist in your memories, but when you look at me, I feel very familiar and close." Fan Xian's eyes were clear and spirited. "You are more curious as to how I avoided your sure-kill strike that day. You are the emissary of the temple. I am a mortal of the world, a target that the temple must eliminate. Why do I understand you so well?" Fan Xian slowly said as he looked at Uncle Wuzhu's indifferent face. "Of course, please believe me. In this world, no one knows better than me what your greatest curiosity is right now. You are curious as to why you feel a sense of familiarity and closeness. What you are most curious about is why you are curious." 7 consecutive sentences about curiosity spat out from Fan Xian's thin and pale lips. There was not the slightest bit of obstruction or hesitation. Some of them gushed out and pressed forward step by step. Some of them only pointed directly at the cold heart covered by the black cloth. After the 7 sentences, Fan Xian immediately felt exhaustion wash over him. He couldn't resist coughing. After he finished coughing, his eyes grew brighter. The hope in his heart grew stronger. No one knew that when Uncle Wu Zhu's metal rod was so close to the cartilage of his throat, even if he moved a sliver, he would bleed on the spot, much less violently cough. The reason he hadn't died after coughing was because of the metal rod in Wu Zhu's hand. It was precise to an unimaginable degree. As Fan Xian's body trembled and moved, it moved forward and backward. To make a snail's horn in an instant was truly powerful. 13th Wang began to stare closely at Fan Xian's hand. When he realized that he couldn't change anything in front of this strange blind man, he began to watch Fan Xian's body nervously. When Fan Xian coughed, his heart also chilled. Immediately after, he realized that Fan Xian was still alive. This reality made him involuntarily admire Fan Xian to the extreme. He also finally understood where Fan Xian's confidence came from when he ignored his and Haitong's objections under the snowy mountain. But, Fan Xian was not nervous at all. Was he not at all worried that he would be killed by this blind man with black cloth in front of him? 13th Wang didn't believe it. He clearly saw that Fan Xian's hands behind his back had been trembling slightly the entire time. 13th Wang took a few steps back toward the stone steps and increased the distance between him and the two of them. He saw Fan Xian's hand gesture and was worried that his existence would disrupt Fan Xian's plans and cause a change to happen to the blind great master. Fan Xian's emotions did not completely relax. He stared closely at the black cloth over Uncle Wu Zhu's eyes, trying to see the endless questions in his heart from his expression. A moment later, he found that all of this was futile. Uncle Wu Zhu's face was still indifferent, and the aura between his brows was still unfamiliar. Being always icy could not be considered familiar. In his life, Wu Zhu had only smiled at Fan Xian a few times. However, Wu Zhu's indifference in front of the temple was truly unfamiliar. Fan Xian's heart sank slightly. His body also sank with it. Very naturally, he sat down in the shallow snow in front of the temple door. He did not care at all about the metal drill at his throat, which could kill him at any moment. Miraculously, Wu Zhu also sat down, sitting in front of the temple door. Sitting there alone, it was as if he was blocking all the prying eyes of the world and the howling wind and snow for thousands of years. The metal drill continued to stretch out in Wu Zhu's hand. It was as steady as his forearm, resting on Fan Xian's throat. Perhaps he could hold it like this for 10,000 years and not feel tired. However, Fan Xian felt tired, particularly as Uncle Wu Zhu sat coldly and did not speak. Perhaps there was some warmth in the heart of this icy body, but it still did not warm up. This reality made Fan Xian feel tired. He didn't know if he could wake up this closest family member. In his life, he was most skilled in battles of the mind. His two most outstanding battles were against Haitang and the Emperor. In the end, Haitang had lost to him. Even someone as powerful as the Qing Emperor could not rest easy under the entanglement of Fan Xian's thoughts. Even though father and son had turned against each other, it still left wounds all over the Emperor's heart. Going to the temple again this time to try to wake Uncle Wu Zhu was, without question, a true battle of the mind. However, it was also the most difficult battle of Fan Xian's life. Uncle Wu Zhu was not immortal. From his body to his thoughts, he was not immortal. He was a legend. He was icy. He was a program. Most importantly, he had forgotten everything. He had forgotten himself and his mother. Wu Zhu sank into an eternally unchanging silence. It brought even more difficulty to Fan Xian's plan. Without conversation, how could he know the changes in the other party's thoughts? How could he take the opportunity to enter and directly strike at the heart? Look at the other party's expression and observe the expression. But, what expression had Uncle Wuzhu ever had in his life? You've been whitewashed. After a long silence, Fan Xian let out a sorrowful sigh. To think that you are a legendary figure in the temple. You are clearly of a higher level than the old man in the temple. How is it that you've been whitewashed? In Fan Xian's view, Uncle Wuzhu, who had feelings, thoughts, and awareness, had always been a living person. Naturally, he was of a much higher level than the old man in the temple who controlled everything but still only knew how to follow the T4 laws. However, it looked like the temple had a method of controlling the emissaries that went out that no one knew about. Otherwise, Wuzhu would not have become an inhuman machine. Although Wuzhu back then was not very human, Fan Xian was not very human. My name is Fan Xian. I told you that day. Although you have forgotten, I want to tell you a story. This story is related to you, and it is also related to me. I hope you can remember something. Of course, even if you remember, perhaps you will not be able to break the chains on your heart. But, we have to try. At least you don't want to kill me. This is probably something in your instincts. Isn't that good? Fan Xian followed the perfectly straight metal rod and looked at Uncle Wuzhu's icy face. He wanted to smile but almost cried. He forcefully took a deep breath and calmed the emotions in his heart. He then began to speak. A long time ago, there was a pretty little girl who lived with you in this temple. Do you still remember? The unmoving metal rod in Wuzhu's hand moved in and out as Fan Xian took a deep breath. It was very miraculous, but it still stuck to Fan Xian's throat. Just like when Fan Xian's throat moved when he spoke, it also moved with the metal rod. However, this movement was very small, so small that it could not be clearly seen by the naked eye. Fan Xian did not care how much Uncle Wuzhu remembered. Calmly and sincerely, he continued to narrate the story related to Wuzhu. The little girl who had helped him escape from the temple. They had gone to Dongyi together. They had met an idiot and done some things. Then, they had gone to Danzhou. They had met a group of idiots and a eunuch idiot. Then, everything else, the snow and the sky slowly floated down. It brought an indescribable feeling of holiness and solemnity to the surroundings of the temple. Perhaps the old man in the temple was using a silent method to endlessly urge Wuzhu to move. Fan Xian sometimes coughed and sometimes was silent. His unusually raspy and tired voice seemed to be the complete opposite of an order. It had Wuzhu maintain his current posture and sit motionlessly by the door of the temple. Gradually, the white snow covered their bodies. Wuzhu was clearly closer to the eaves of the temple, but more snow had accumulated on his body. Perhaps it was because his body temperature was relatively low. The weather grew colder and colder. The snow on Fan Xian's body melted and flowed down along his leather jacket. The coldness seeped into his body and made him cough more frequently. However, his words did not stop at all. He continued to narrate the past, everything about Wuzhu's past. The scene on that carriage seems to be rewinding. Fan Xian coughed and used the corner of his sleeve to wipe away his snot, which had already turned to ice. Although he was wretched, the light in his eyes did not dim at all. He knew that this battle of the heart was a battle against the temple's control over Uncle Wuzhu. He did not have any room to relax. In Danzhou, you opened a general store, but business was not very good. It was often closed. Your face was always icy, so of course, no one was willing to look after your business. Fan Xian smiled sourly and continued in a raspy voice, "Of course, I was willing to look after your business. Although I was still young at the time, you often prepared some good wine for me to drink." As he spoke, Fan Xian seemed to have returned to his childhood after his rebirth. At that time, life in Danzhou was somewhat dull and tedious. His grandmother treated him strictly but kindly and refused to slack off in her studies. Furthermore, the people of Danzhou did not give him the opportunity to kill in all directions. He could only desperately practice the tyrannical martial method, follow Sir Fei everywhere to dig up corpses, and work hard to memorize the Overwatch Council's regulations and execution rules. He also had to prevent assassination attempts. However, those were, after all, the happiest days of Fan Xian's 2 lives. It was not only because of Danzhou's refreshing sea breeze and the beautiful camellias covering the mountain. It was also not because of Dong Er's gentleness or the 4 serving girls' loveliness. The biggest reason was because of that general store, that icy blind young servant, the yellow flowers on the precipice, and the education under the stick. As Fan Xian spoke, he was somewhat lost in thought. He thought of when he went to the general store to steal wine to drink as a child. Uncle Wu Zhu would always shred radishes for him to drink without caring how old he was. Involuntarily, a glimmer of warmth rose to the corners of his lips. Like a magic trick, Fan Xian took out a radish from his swollen leather jacket and then a kitchen knife. He began to chop at the green stone ground in front of the temple, cutting the radish. The green stone ground in front of the temple had experienced thousands of years of wind, frost, and snow, but it was still smooth. Using it as a chopping board, although it was a bit stiff, it had a certain crispness. The knife moved like it was flying. In just a moment, a frozen and crisp radish was cut into shreds of uniform thickness and placed neatly on the green stone ground. While cutting the radish, Fan Xian didn't speak. Wu Zhu tilted his head and looked calmly at the knife and radish in Fan Xian's hand through the black cloth. It seemed that he didn't understand what was happening in front of him. Cutting radish shreds in front of the temple, if Fan Xian could survive, presumably would be the most arrogant thing he had ever done in his life. It was more arrogant than jumping off the palace walls to kill Qin Yi, more arrogant than charging into the royal palace to slap the Empress Dowager, and even more arrogant than entering the palace with a single sword to assassinate the emperor. However, Wu Zhu still didn't seem to remember anything. He was just curious about Fan Xian's senseless action. Fan Xian lowered his head and sighed. He threw the kitchen knife to the side and pointed at the radish shreds in front of him. In a light voice, he said, "Back then, you always complained that my radish shreds weren't cut well. What do you think of my cutting now?" Wu Zhu straightened his head and remained cold and silent. A thick coldness grew in Fan Xian's heart. He suddenly felt that he was doing useless work. No matter what he did, it was impossible to wake Uncle Wu Zhu. Uncle Wu Zhu was already dead and would never come back to life again. The world was very cold. The temple was very cold. However, Fan Xian seemed to have only just felt it. His entire body shivered. He suddenly gritted his teeth with all his strength. He bit down until a trail of blood seeped out from the corner of his lips. He stared fixedly at Wu Zhu angrily. It was a long time before his emotions calmed down. In a dark voice, he said, "I don't believe this. Don't pretend. I know you remember. I know you remember." Fan Xian's voice was extremely raspy. The continuous talking had hurt his vocal cords. "I don't believe you've forgotten the many years we spent together on the cliff. I don't believe you've forgotten. That night, when we were talking about the chest and mother, you smiled. Have you forgotten? What about that rainy night? You tricked Hong Xiang out of the palace. Later, you bragged to me that you could kill him. We stole the key back and opened the chest. Then, you smiled again." Fan Xian coughed violently and scolded, "You clearly know how to smile. Why are you pretending to be dead?" Wu Zhu still did not move. The metal drill in his hand also did not move as it pierced Fan Xian's throat. The snow continued to fall coldly. In front of the temple, other than Fan Xian's voice, there was no other movement. Gradually, the sky darkened slightly. Perhaps it was already night, or perhaps it was just the clouds thickening. However, the snow above Fan Xian's head stopped. A rustling sound rang out. 13th Wang's head was covered in sweat. He set up a small spare tent behind Fan Xian and then pushed it over Fan Xian's head, covering his entire body. Coincidentally, the tent's door was between Fan Xian and Wu Zhu, so he did not move the stable metal drill. The snow was heavy. 13th Wang was worried about Fan Xian's health, so he had gone through a lot of trouble earlier and rushed back to the camp as quickly as possible. He had brought a small tent to help Fan Xian block the snow. No wonder he was panting so heavily. Perhaps Fan Xian knew, or perhaps he didn't. He only stared unblinkingly at Wu Zhu with his absent-minded or lifeless eyes. In an unpleasant and raspy voice, he spoke with all his might. Fan Xian was not a chatterbox. The words he said that day were probably more than he had in his entire life. After 13th Wang finished all this, he glanced at the two strange people at the door of the temple with a complicated expression. He once again sat down on the stone steps covered in snow. Only 3 idiots could do such an idiotic thing. A day and a night passed. The metal drill in Wu Zhu's hand didn't leave Fan Xian's throat for a day and a night. It seemed that even he didn't know why he didn't want to kill this talkative mortal in front of him. Fan Xian spoke non-stop for a day and a night. It seemed that even he didn't know that his saliva had long dried up. The food and water that 13th Wang had brought had all been put aside by him. His saliva dried up and regrown. After his vocal cords were damaged, they were extremely raspy. In the end, the spittle he brought had even been dyed pink. His throat began to bleed. His voice began to become so ugly that it was difficult to hear what he meant. His speaking speed was already slower than that of an old man with 1 foot in the grave. 13th Wang listened beside this pair of strange people for a day and a night. He began to listen very seriously. In Fan Xian's bloody and tearful complaints to Wu Zhu, he heard much of the truth of the turbulent times in the land. He learned of many magnificent figures. He also learned of Fan Xian's childhood and life as a youth. When Fan Xian began to repeat his life biography for the 3rd time and took out a kitchen knife for the 4th time to mimic the action of slicing radishes, hoping that Wu Zhu would remember something, 13th Wang couldn't bear to listen anymore. He hugged his knees and sat by the stone steps. Looking at the strange and beautiful shadows in the distance on the snowy mountain range, his fingers unconsciously gathered the ashes and traces of ashes by his side. It was Sigujian's remains. When Haitang walked to the door of the temple, this was the scene she saw. She saw 3 idiot-like people. 13th Wang was sitting on the stone steps in a daze, playing with his teacher's ashes. Fan Xian was sitting like a little statue of a village god in the doorway of a small tent. He continued to speak in a raspy and unpleasant voice, as vague and difficult to understand content that was like a heavenly book. Wu Zhu extended the metal drill and didn't move at all. He was very much like a statue. This statue was covered from head to toe in snow and didn't have a glimmer of life. The metal drill lay between Wu Zhu and Fan Xian. It was as if it separated 2 completely different, untouchable worlds. Regardless of whether it was thrust out or pulled back, perhaps everyone present would feel much better. Yet, it was this coldness and stability that lay between the 2 of them. It made one feel endless sorrow and pain. One person couldn't bear to leave, but the person who couldn't bear to leave still didn't understand. The most painful thing in the world was nothing more than not understanding. With just one glance, Haitang knew what had happened during this day and night. A bitterness that was difficult to suppress rose in her heart. It was not until now that she was certain that, for Fan Xian, there were always many things that were more important than his life. He's gone mad. Haitang looked in a daze at the clearly inauspicious red flush on Fan Xian's face. She listened to his raspy, slow, and indistinct voice. She looked at the specks of blood-colored saliva on the snow on Wu Zhu's body. Her heart felt a stabbing pain. 13th Wang stood with unusual difficulty. Looking at her in silence for a moment, he said, "You've gone mad. Otherwise, why wouldn't you listen to him and come up? I just felt that since he was going to die, I also wanted to see him die. Haitang glanced at 13th Wang and said with her head slightly lowered. He won't be able to hold out for long. His injury has never healed. That day, he was stabbed through and lost too much blood. Even if he wanted to pass through the icy plains and return south, it would be a difficult task. Furthermore, he doesn't care for his life and insisted on trying. 13th Wang turned around and stood side by side with Haitang. He looked at Fan Xian, who seemed to know nothing and feel nothing and continued to try to wake Wu Zhu. Calmly, he said, he's been talking for an entire day and night and has been frozen for an entire day and night. If he continues like this, there is only death. Can you persuade him to leave? It looks like the blind great master didn't listen to the order of the immortals in the temple to kill him. It would be better if you killed him. Then you wouldn't have to be like me last night, hearing his hopeless voice the entire time. 13th Wang suddenly smiled and said, however, I truly admire Fan Xian. It is very rare to see someone so ruthless to himself. Haitang looked at Fan Xian's pale, flushed, and exhausted face. She looked at it for a long time. Suddenly, her body trembled slightly. A glimmer of light rose in her eyes that was brighter than the mountain range and valley. 13th Wang suddenly felt a ripple beside him. He stared at Haitang with wide eyes. A mouthful of fresh blood sprayed out and struck the black cloth close to him. It then flowed down the icy snow on that icy face. It appeared particularly ghastly. However, Wu Zhu still did not move. With unusual difficulty, Fan Xian wiped away the blood at the corner of his lips. He knew that he was at the end of his rope. A hopeless feeling rose in his heart. The family in front of him was still unfamiliar, still cold, still soulless, still dead. Fan Xian couldn't help but shiver again. He suddenly remembered that Uncle Wu Zhu had always been responsible for spreading the fire seed for the temple and had walked the world for tens of thousands of years. He probably had hundreds of thousands of years' worth of memories in his mind. Perhaps, the unforgettable memories he had coughed up blood and repeated this day and night were only common existences for the body in front of him that was as cold as a snowy mountain. It was the same for his mother, Yi Qingmei's memories. It was as if he could use these common stories to awaken a person with countless experiences and memories. What a childish and absurd idea. Thinking of this, all of Fan Xian's hopes turned to dust. A sense of hopelessness rose in his eyes. His voice was slightly twisted. It appeared particularly distressed and unclear. He roared in a raspy voice at the eternally unmoving Uncle Wu Zhu in front of him, "How could you forget me? Are you addicted to amnesia? Last time, you at least remembered Yi Qingmei. How could you forget even me this time?" The metal drill was close at hand, still at the vital point of his throat. Fan Xian's entire body trembled. His body was stiff. He sank into a death-like silence because he had already lost his voice. He could no longer say anything. His body trembled more and more violently. The hopelessness in his eyes had long transformed into the flames of madness and anger. He stared fixedly at the black cloth on Wu Zhu's face. A sinister and vicious expression suddenly flashed across his face. He leaped toward the other party. Fan Xian's body had long been frozen. Although he had leaped, in reality, he was falling straight toward Wu Zhu's position. His throat crashed into the metal drill. The tip of the metal drill retreated swiftly, but Fan Xian still fell down. He fell down heavily. Thus, the metal drill in Wu Zhu's hand could only retreat further. When there was nowhere else to retreat, he could only let go, allowing Fan Xian, who had been frozen like a popsicle, to fall in front of him. Fan Xian extended a hand and viciously grabbed a corner of Wu Zhu's clothes. Snow rustled and fell down. He stared into Wu Zhu's eyes. Although he could not speak, the vicious and self-confident look in his eyes declared one thing. "You don't want to kill me. You don't want to kill me." You can't kill me. Although you don't know who I am, your instincts, your heart, have me. Come with me. Fan Xian, who had been unable to speak, suddenly became spirited. He let go of the metal drill and lowered his head in thought. His desperate leap had finally pushed the metal drill between him and Wu Zhu away. The distance between the two worlds could not be any closer. It was at this moment that Fan Xian made his request. Wu Zhu was silent for a long time. His face was still expressionless. I don't know who you are. When you don't know anything, just follow your heart. What is the heart? Feelings? Feelings are only a method humans use to deceive themselves and numb themselves. In the end, they can only deceive for a while. Life has always been a moment plus a moment. If you can deceive for a while, you can deceive for a lifetime. If you can deceive for a lifetime, how can it be considered deceiving? But I still don't know who you are. I also don't know who I am. You don't need to know who I am. If you want to know who you are, you have to come with me. I know you are curious. Curiosity is a feeling that only humans have. You are human. Only humans want to know what is on the other side of the mountain, what is on the other side of the sea, what are the stars, what is the sun. What is on the other side of the mountain? You have to see for yourself. Since you want to know what is outside the temple, you have to come with me. Why is this conversation so familiar? But I still don't quite understand it. Do not be at a loss. Flash like lightning and let out a thunderbolt from your eyes. Do what you think. If you can't figure it out, follow your heart and leave this temple where even birds don't shit. But the temple, these conversations did not actually happen. At least, Wu Zhu and Fan Xian, who was lying in the snow, did not have such a conversation. After Fan Xian said those 3 words, the two of them only looked at each other in silence. Then, Wu Zhu, with great difficulty, bent his body and picked up Fan Xian. He then placed him on his back. It was just like the blind young servant carrying the infant many years ago. Fan Xian felt the icy cold back in front of him, but he felt it was unusually warm. The expression on his face was indifferent because the emotions in his heart could not be expressed with any expression. He wanted to cry, but he also wanted to laugh. He knew that Uncle Wu Zhu still did not remember anything, but he knew that Uncle Wu Zhu was willing to leave this broken temple with him. Thus, he wanted to cry out happily, but he could not. He wanted to cry out loud, but he was so cold that he curled up into a ball. He could only cough furiously, endlessly coughing up blood. Then, Fan Xian saw Hai Tang and 13th Wang, the 2 most powerful young warriors in the world. At this moment, their faces were pale, and their eyes were dim. It was as if they had just experienced the most terrifying thing in the world. What was most frightening was that both of them were trembling all over. It was as if they were about to lose control of the terror in their hearts. What had happened to make Hai Tang and 13th Wang like this? 13th Wang looked at the scene in front of him and knew that Fan Xian had won. However, there did not seem to be a glimmer of happiness on his face. There was only lingering fear and a glimmer of faint regret. His entire body trembled like the second disciple of Wu Zhu. Gazing at Fan Xian, he said in a dry voice, "We destroyed the temple." The title of the chapter is from an old book, The Most Powerful, My Name. If you have time, you can read it. Chapter 758. I have an important dinner tonight and cannot push it off. I have written less today. I saluted with my hands. Smashed the temple. Hearing these words come out of 13th Wang's trembling voice, Fan Xian couldn't help but shiver on Wu Zhu's back. He looked at his 2 companions not far in front of him and couldn't say anything. He knew 13th Wang was speaking the truth because Hai Tang and 13th Wang's pale faces and unusually complicated gaze revealed everything. There were not many things in this world that could make these 2 so frightened. Fan Xian coughed violently and couldn't make a sound. He only felt his scalp go numb. Strand by strand of hair were like needles stabbing into his skull. He felt a wave of pain and fear that was difficult to suppress. He was not afraid that after the temple was smashed, the old man formed from specks of light would immediately use a weapon of mass destruction to kill him. It was just the ruins of a broken temple with a guide. If it was smashed, then it was smashed. What was he afraid of? He was worried about the person in front of him. He was worried that after Wu Zhu heard the news of the temple being smashed, he would remember his duty as a temple guard. In an instant, Fan Xian changed his mind. When the temple was smashed, Uncle Wu Zhu must have known what was happening inside. He hadn't moved earlier. He couldn't possibly move now, could he? He had extravagant hopes in his heart because right now, his body and spirit were both extremely weak. He could no longer fiercely respond. He had spent an entire day and night, and in the end, he had risked his life to move the icy heart under the black cloth and persuade Wu Zhu to leave with him. If anything happened now, he might even have the heart to die. Fan Xian would not blame Haitang and 13th Wang. He knew that his two companions saw that he was about to die and couldn't bear to watch. That was why they had made such an unusually daring move. Perhaps it was because the temple had been smashed that Uncle Wu Zhu had one less spiritual shackle and had become a living person from a statue. Thinking of this, he felt even more gratitude toward Haitang and 13th Wang. He knew that these two did not have the knowledge and experience of his previous life. In their hearts, particularly in Haitang's heart, she had spent her entire life serving the temple. At this moment, she had smashed the temple for him. A number of thoughts flashed through Fan Xian's mind like flowing light. He nervously watched Uncle Wu Zhu's thin and steady shoulders in front of him. Wu Zhu did not move. When Fan Xian coughed up blood in an attempt to wake Wu Zhu, Haitang and 13th Wang floated in through the slightly ajar door of the temple. At that time, Fan Xian's entire attention was focused on Wu Zhu in front of him and did not notice at all. Wu Zhu also seemed to have ignored him due to some fluctuating emotions. Thus, Haitang and 13th Wang went in and smashed. After they were done, they came out like thugs who had confiscated property. However, their bodies were still trembling. The paleness of their faces had not improved at all. They had never thought that in this lifetime, they would not only be able to come to the temple to worship, but they would also be able to smash the things in the temple into a mess. In the eyes of the people of the world, the status of the temple was lofty and illusory. Furthermore, a few days ago, they had personally seen the immortal floating in midair. They were not like Fan Xian, who dared to be disrespectful to an existence that completely exceeded human imagination. They also did not have the extravagant hope that they could defeat the immortal. Thus, when they entered the temple, they held on to the belief that they would die. They only wanted to disturb the spirits of the immortals in the temple and have Fan Xian find an opportunity to save the blind great master. Who would have thought that they would so easily destroy the temple? The immortal was frozen in the air. Haitang and 13th Wang thought they were blind and didn't look at him because they didn't dare to. The immortal's voice rang out beside their ears. They thought they were deaf and didn't listen at all because they didn't dare to. Trembling like this, they thought they were going to die. They went in and smashed randomly. In the end, the immortal disappeared just like that. The most wondrous and inconceivable thing in the world was this. As Haitang and 13th Wang stood trembling outside the temple door, they still didn't dare to believe what they had experienced in the temple earlier. Uncle Wu Zhu did not move. Fan Xian relaxed slightly and looked stupidly at his two stupefied companions in front of him. He thought to himself that the ways of the world were truly difficult to explain. A moment later, he used his saliva to moisten his throat. Feeling that he could open his mouth to speak, he said in a raspy voice, "You are very powerful." Cold snow floated down on the desolate snowy plains. The sky was so gray that it was impossible to tell whether it was day or night. Only the endless wind and snow swirled and moved between the icy plains and snowy hills, blocking out most of the light. Amidst the deathly silence, the occasional not very loud barking of a dog could be heard, startling the thousands and tens of thousands of years of silence in the snowy plains of the extreme north. A few sledges were moving with difficulty toward the south in the wind and snow. On the sledge at the very front stood a young man holding a wooden stick. Facing the wind and snow, he narrowed his eyes and looked in that direction. The second sledge was arranged particularly tightly. In front of it was a snow canopy that blocked out the wind and snow. On the sledge, a pale-faced young man was half lying in the arms of a girl. However, the girl was wearing a fur coat, so it was impossible to see her figure. At the back of the sledge procession was a youth wearing cotton clothing. His eyes were covered with a black cloth. He followed at a moderate distance. Pulled by the snow hounds, the sledges moved quickly. However, this blind youth took steady steps. He did not appear fast, but in reality, he was not pulled down at all. Fan Xian gently turned his neck and turned his head to glance at the back of the procession, at Uncle Wuxia, who was walking step by step in the ice and snow. A faint sorrow and disappointment rose in his eyes. However, he didn't say anything. He closed his eyes again and began to use the yuanqi in the wind and snow to heal the injuries in his body. Most of the dozens of snow hounds had died on this difficult journey. Only 11, led by Da and Er, remained. These snow hounds had probably never been to such a northern and cold place in their lives. Their animal instincts made them fearful and uneasy. That was why, under 13th Wang's suppression, they still couldn't stop themselves from barking a few times at the gray sky. Fortunately, this was the second time they had been on this path. Otherwise, who knew if these snow hounds would be scared stiff by the unmelting ice and snow and the lifeless world. After coming down from the snowy mountain, Wuxia still maintained his coldness and silence. He only followed Fan Xian's procession from a distance and didn't open his mouth to say anything. He still didn't remember anything. Perhaps, it should be said that he didn't know anything. He was just an icy shell. Yet, because of a speck of light in his soul, he descended the snowy mountain, left the temple, and began to follow the sledge procession south, if Wuxia had a soul. Thus, Fan Xian was sad and disappointed. He didn't know how long this situation would last. He didn't know if Uncle Wuxia would wake up. If he truly couldn't wake up, this Wuxia would still not be the Wuxia he was. A snowflake was picked up by the wind and floated into the sleigh in a strange curve, covering Fan Xian's eyes. Haitang was slightly startled. She was about to use her finger to brush the snowflake away when unexpectedly, Fan Xian opened his eyes and looked at her with a slight smile. There was an indescribable feeling in the warmth of his smile. Haitang avoided his gaze and looked at 13th Wang standing in the snow in front of her. Her face blushed faintly. It had been a number of years since the two of them had first met. She rarely showed such a girlish side in front of Fan Xian. However, this time, they had gone deep into the snowy plains of the extreme north, visited the temple, and experienced things that mortals had never experienced in countless lifetimes. Haitang Duoduo's heart was no longer the same as before. Fan Xian saw her avoid his gaze, but his smile did not fade. On the contrary, he felt warmth in his heart. The matter of the temple being smashed had the greatest impact on his emotions. He knew that at the time, Haitang and 13th Wang had gone with the intent to die. Most importantly, the two of them had to suppress their innate reverence and fear toward the temple. This kind of friendship was rare in the world. His eyes narrowed slightly. His gaze pierced through the wind and snow and landed on the snowy mountain far behind him. Logically speaking, the snowy mountain should have long disappeared from sight. However, he always felt that the snowy mountain was there and the temple was there. The day before, in the snowy mountain, Fan Xian had entered the temple again in the end. He also saw the messy state of the temple. His emotions were unusually complicated. There was also a faint sense of sorrow and pity. After all, it was the last remnant of his world. If it was truly destroyed in his hands, fortunately, as Fan Xian had expected, the spots of light condensed again. The gentle but actually emotionless old man of the temple appeared again. Perhaps the temple had already determined that the first and last emissary in the temple had already broken free of control, so it did not say anything about clearing out the target again. Even Fan Xian had not found the center of the temple or the last military museum. Hai Tang and 13th Wang had probably only destroyed a few ancillary facilities. In the temple, Fan Xian and the elder had a final conversation. As for what they talked about, only Fan Xian knew. After this conversation, Fan Xian resolutely left the temple and left the old man alone in the snowy mountain. "I'll leave you for a lifetime and wait for the temple to regenerate itself. You'll be able to survive and die alone." This was Fan Xian's revenge against the temple. He believed that in such a world of ice and snow and without the support of resources, the temple could not cause any trouble. If it truly had such power, it would not have watched as the emissaries in the temple died one by one without being able to do anything about it. Besides, there was still Wuxia in the world. Chapter 759. In the autumn of the 12th year of the Qing calendar, the leaves on either side of the road gradually became round as they headed south. They also began to wither and yellow. The scenery along the road changed along with the climate, clearly depicting the landscape of this world. A horse carriage was steadily moving on the official road. Fan Xian, who had disappeared from this world for more than half a year, had finally returned to this world. The people who passionately hoped for his death or hoped for his survival still did not know of his return. After experiencing many hardships and passing through the snowy plains once again, the four of them quietly snuck into the world and did not send out a clear signal to any power. Hai Tang and 13th Wang knew the heaviness in Fan Xian's heart. Wuxia, who still did not have a trace of humanity, only sat silently at the back of the carriage. Presumably, he did not understand the trivial matters of the world and would not care about them. In the capital of Wuxia County in northern Qi, the carriage stopped outside an inn. After a while, Fan Xian left the inn alone and headed toward the busiest brothel in the city. Behind him, Wuxia, covered by a black cloth, followed at a moderate distance. It was not Fan Xian's intention to come out with Uncle Wuxia. However, he also did not understand. Uncle Wuxia clearly did not remember anything and knew nothing, so why did he continue to follow him? In a secret room in a branch of Baoyue brothel, Fan Xian saw Xiaofan, who had already waited for a full 4 months, as well as Wang Qinian and Deng Ziyu. Under the powerful pressure of the Qing Emperor and royal palace, there were not many loyal subordinates who still stood bravely by his side. Other than the three in the secret room, there was only Xia Qifei, who was struggling to survive in Jiangnan. Seeing Fan Xian alive and well, the faces of these three loyal subordinates all revealed expressions of disbelief and joy. The entire world knew that Fan Xian had gone to the temple. In reality, everyone, regardless of whether they were Fan Xian's friends or enemies, thought Fan Xian would certainly die in the temple. Who would have thought that he would be able to return alive? After a moment of excitement, Fan Xian smiled and had everyone sit down. He had no time to talk about this journey that was not very pleasant and that even he could not explain clearly. Wang Qinian squatted to the side and smoked a pot. Deng Ziyu placed all the important intelligence reports in the world in front of Fan Xian. Fan Xian glanced at it. The worry in his eyes grew stronger and stronger. Xiaofan glanced at the blind youth beside the secret room. For some reason, he felt a chill in his heart. He didn't know who this person was to be able to come to such an important place with his teacher. He swallowed and said, "The Qing Kingdom's northern camp will break camp on the 3rd of June. The first contact between the two sides will be 7 days later. Why is northern Qi so defeated?" Fan Xian's expression became heavy. Looking at him, he asked, "Furthermore, in Wuxia County, I didn't sense much fear from the northern Qi people. The northern Qi side retreated 300 li. Strangely, according to our investigations, Shang Shanhu was not on the battlefield. Instead, he chose to defend the city of the Song Kingdom. Deng Ziyu stepped forward and replied. He then spread out the map on the table. Pointing at the battlefield, he said in a heavy voice, "This position is in the middle of the spine. If the Qing Kingdom's border army directly invades the north, Shang Shanhu will use the momentum to come out and directly attack the spine. Although this famous general has chosen to be on the defensive, his defense is unusually dangerous. This is the city that Shang Shanhu took after the battle in the north last year. So, this piece ultimately landed in this place." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He had not thought that while he was exploring the temple in the north, he would not know how much time had passed in the mountains. The situation in this land had long undergone an earth-shattering change. Just as they were returning south from the snowy plains, the Qing Iron Riders had finally begun their northern expedition. Since the emperor has made up his mind to use the power of the entire country on an expedition to the northern camp is nothing more than the vanguard. Under the invasion of such a murderous aura, even someone as strong as Shang Shanhu can only choose to be on the defensive. This is dictated by the strength of the country. It has nothing to do with the genius of an individual commander. Deng Ziyu was, after all, an official of the Overwatch Council. Compared to Shi Chanli, he had a clearer assessment of the recent battle situation between the two powers of the north and south. Looking at Fan Xian with worry, he said, "The northern camp has left Zhangzhou. The northern Qi side has retreated 300 li. However, where the blade points, in the end, there has still been a great battle on the wastelands. The northern camp is temporarily resting and reorganizing, but there are frequent movements of soldiers in Yanjing. It looks like the second attack is close at hand. Although Shang Shanhu has the geographical advantage of that city, if Yanjing and the northern camp combine forces to attack the west, Shang Shanhu will probably have to be dragged into the field battle. I don't understand war, but I know that if the emperor has truly made up his mind, no matter how talented Shang Shanhu is, in the end, he can only be slowly exhausted to death." Fan Xian lowered his head and looked at the silent cities on the map. In a slow voice, he said, "It is clear that although Northern Qi has prepared for this battle for many years, in terms of military affairs, they are no match for the Qing Kingdom. They only hope to exhaust the Qing Kingdom until Shang Shanhu exhausts himself, but the emperor does not want to accompany him in exhausting himself. Even if they continue to exhaust themselves, the emperor will be the final victor." Deng Ziyu and Shi Chanli glanced at Fan Xian with worry in their eyes. They were traitors of the Qing Kingdom, but they were, after all, Qing people. They belonged to the third power in the world. At this moment, the battle between the two sides had begun. Their position and identity were truly awkward. Furthermore, they still didn't know what Fan Xian thought of this matter. Thus, during this month, the power that belonged to Fan Xian had not made a move. Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly and used his finger to gently tap the position of the nameless city. He thought that Shang Shanhu was probably preparing in the city that belonged to the Song Kingdom in name. Suddenly, a powerful sense of unease surged in his heart. If I were the emperor, if I really wanted to fight for time and not waste it with Shang Shanhu, the simplest method would be for two powerful armies to advance together and then choose one to circle around to the back of the Song Kingdom. Shang Shanhu would then want to hide his knife in its sheath. If we were to circle around to the back of the Song Kingdom, that would be like borrowing a path from Dongyi. Although Dongyi belongs to the Qing Kingdom in name, if the army were to enter Dongyi. Deng Ziyu glanced at Fan Xian. The Great Prince and the Black Knights are not in Dongyi. They are on the border between the Liang Kingdom and the Song Kingdom. If the Qing army wanted to borrow a path, they would probably receive a sudden attack. These words were not said clearly. Everyone in the secret room knew that Dongyi now belonged to Fan Xian. In such a battle that involved the entire world, what kind of attitude Dongyi would display? Whether or not the Qing emperor would valiantly send out troops was, in the end, a matter between the emperor and Fan Xian, father and son. If the emperor had not sent out troops to attack Dongyi at the beginning, it would mean that he knew I was not dead. Then, he would not have chosen this path in the future. Fan Xian sighed and rubbed the spot between his brows. Let's not talk about this anymore. In the end, it is not something I can handle. I only care about the situation in Jingdo and Jiangnan. All of these situations were in the files Deng Ziyu had submitted. There was too much content, and Fan Xian did not have time to read them all in detail. Jiangnan is stable. The court has withdrawn the new rules for the palace treasury bidding. As you expected, the salt merchants have also joined in the matter of the palace treasury bidding. Fortunately, the Ming family still holds a portion of the market. Of course, it is much more wretched than in previous years. Is Xia Qifei's person all right? After the assassination last year, the court did not make any further moves against Ming Garden. Governor Xueqing is only suppressing Xia Qifei. Looking at the moment, it will not carry out direct action. Fan Xian sank into deep thought. It looked like the emperor had, in the end, kept his promise in the palace. After all, the fate of the palace treasury was in his hands. If the emperor wanted to last through the ages, he could only temporarily take a step back in front of his threat. After Sun Jingxiu was removed from his position, the original plan was to be banished. For some reason, the palace suddenly sent down an edict and pardoned his crime. The young lady of the Sun family was released the night before she entered the educational workshop. Presently, life in the Sun Manor is very difficult, but the people of the He faction have been killed wretchedly, so no one will kick them when they are down. Speaking of this, a glimmer of a smile rose to the corners of Deng Ziyu's lips. Although he had not participated in the Jingdo matter, the Overwatch Council's killing spree in Jingdo and the officials of the He faction were about to be wiped out. This truly made this abandoned official of the Overwatch Council feel incomparable joy. However, the people of the council have all withdrawn from Jingdo according to your orders, so they are unable to help. Fan Xian nodded. In his heart, he felt that the matter was more and more strange. When did the emperor become such a benevolent ruler? Was it just to keep the bet between them? Is everything all right at home? He shook his head and temporarily let go of the things he couldn't figure out in his heart. Gazing at Wang Qinian, he asked. Wang Qinian coughed twice and smiled as he replied softly, "They couldn't be better. Everyone in the world is dumbfounded. Princess Chen and young lady enter the palace every day to talk with His Majesty. Young master and young lady are also very healthy." The situation in Jingdo had indeed dumbfounded everyone under heaven. Fan Xian was now a traitor of the Qing kingdom, but the emperor had no intention of condemning the Fan faction. Even the women who should have been implicated now had faintly higher positions in the Qing kingdom than before the assassination in the royal palace. After Fan Xian heard this news, he couldn't help but be startled in the distance. Deng Ziyu suddenly opened his mouth and said, "The results of the investigation in Yingzhou show that the people who attacked Wenmao were border soldiers who had retreated from the south road pretending to be mountain bandits." A cold light flashed through Fan Xian's eyes. He quickly asked, "Where are they?" "In the end, we found Wenmao's body. It was covered by the snow at the time." Deng Ziyu slowly closed his eyes. At the time, he was missing an arm. The old subordinates of the council searched for a long time but couldn't find him. "I'm going back to Jingdo." After a long silence, Fan Xian raised his head and looked at his three closest subordinates beside him. With great difficulty, he smiled and said, "Immediately retreat to Dongyi. Don't gather together again. Otherwise, if someone catches you all, where would I go to cry?" Hearing that Fan Xian was returning to Jingdo, Wang Qinian and the other two were shocked. Wang Qinian had been with Fan Xian the longest and understood Fan Xian's thoughts the best. He was also the least particular with his words. In a hoarse voice, he urged, although the emperor has not carried out a purge, you know that if you appear in Jingdo, he will stop at nothing to kill you. I know. Right now, your life is involved in that bet. More importantly, as long as you are alive, the emperor will have some fear. Your life will affect the lives and deaths of many people. I know. Fan Xian lowered his eyes slightly. Fan Xian lowered his eyelids slightly. But, I will have to return to Jingdo because things will have to be resolved. Even if I hide in Dongyi for a lifetime, I still won't be able to resolve it. There was another death-like silence. A light suddenly flashed through Fan Xian's mind. He stared at Wang Qinian and asked, "We discussed earlier that the northern camp in Yanjing can clearly waste time with Shang Shanhu, but the emperor clearly doesn't want to waste time. Why is that?" Wang Qinian was silent for a moment. He then said, "There is news from the palace that the emperor's body seems to have problems." After these words were said, Deng Ziyu and Shi Chanli's expressions changed drastically. They knew that the emperor's health was the most important matter in the world. The problem was that one of them was responsible for the intelligence work of the old subordinates of the Overwatch Council, and the other was responsible for the Baoyue brothel intelligence network that covered the world. Yet, they had never heard any news related to the emperor's health. Wang Qinian spoke with such certainty. It made it difficult for them to believe it. Fan Xian stared into Wang Qinian's eyes and slowly nodded his head after a long time. He knew where Wang Qinian's news came from. Even when Chen Pingping was alive, he did not know of Hongzhu's existence. However, Fan Xian had given it to Wang Qinian. Clearly, this news had come from Hongzhu. The secret room was silent for a long time. The three of them knew that no one in the world could stop Fan Xian's actions. Shi Chanli smiled with great difficulty and said, "Sir, are you not going to tell us the story of this journey? After Master Ku He, you are the first person to return alive from the temple. It's just a rundown temple. What is there to tell?" Fan Xian smiled. He knew that everyone was actually very curious about that illusory place. However, his mood was heavy and he indeed had no interest in talking. He only glanced lightly at Uncle Wu Zhu at the door of the secret room and wondered, when exactly will the blind uncle wake up? In Langjia County, the group of 3 young warriors who had entered the Snow Mountain Temple parted. 13th Wang was going to use the fastest speed to hurry to Dongyi and inform the Great Prince, who was guarding Dongyi alone, as well as the people in the Sword Hut, of the news that Fan Xian was alive and Fan Xian's arrangements. Haitong's departure was within Fan Xian's expectations. The great battle had already begun. Although Northern Qi had the power to fight, the situation was dangerous. As a Northern Qi saint girl, Haitang could not stay out of it. She had to rush back to Shangjing and to the side of the Northern Qi Emperor. Using her identity as the leader of Qing Mountain's Tianyi Dao, she had to help her country resist foreign invaders. When they parted, the expression in Haitong's tired eyes made Fan Xian feel a strange sense of pity. He didn't know how long Northern Qi would be able to hold out against the Qing Emperor's valiant will and war to unify the world. He also didn't know if the beautiful royal palace would be burned to ashes if the Qing army actually broke through Shangjing. Or, in those flames, would Haitang, Lily, and the Emperor's woman be found? Regardless of whether it was from his personal view of history, personality, or any other aspect, Fan Xian could only have one attitude toward the bloody flames of war that slowly began. He had to stop all of this. However, he didn't make any promises to Haitang or express anything. He was just silent. Taking Uncle Wu Zhu, he walked alone toward the south. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation, Endless Fantasy Translation Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation, Endless Fantasy Translation. Under the clear sky, Fan Xian and Wu Zhu walked south in silence. Fan Xian's mood was heavy. He didn't know what he could do once he returned to Jingdo. For some reason, his instincts, as well as the news that the emperor might be seriously ill, urged his footsteps to never stop. The most successful sidekick after Wang Qinian, Su Wen Mao, had died. That autumn, the old cripple had died a long time ago. Even earlier, Yi Qingmei had also died. After experiencing the great joys and sorrows of the human race in the temple, Fan Xian should have viewed life and death more indifferently. For some reason, once he stepped into the world, there were more worldly thoughts in his heart. Remembering life and death and paying for life and death. How could he just laugh it off? It was still a black carriage. Fan Xian sat in the carriage and looked at Uncle Wu Zhu sitting beside the driver's seat. He was not surprised to find that the side of Uncle Wu Zhu's face was still delicate and pretty. The black cloth was still enchanting in the autumn wind. Everything was actually very similar to the scene from Jingdou to Danzhou 20 years ago. The one who was different was still Wu Zhu. This peerless warrior seemed to have lost his soul. He did not say a word or do a single thing. His cold face could not reveal whether or not he was curious about everything in this world that was both strange and familiar. Fan Xian felt a faint sorrow and gently let down the curtain. Shortly after, he smiled mockingly at himself. Back then, Uncle Wu Zhu was blind. Now, he had become a mute. What had his mother done in the past? What should he do? After the carriage reached Nanling County, it did not go any further. More accurately, the driver did not want to go any further. Although the Northern Qi court had long tried to downplay the war in the south, war was not as easily covered up as the scandal of the royal family. Everyone in the world knew what had happened in the center of the land. The millions of people all used indifferent and wary gazes to nervously wait for the result. Naturally, the driver did not want to enter the battlefield. Taking out silver to buy the carriage, Fan Xian took on the role of driver and continued south with Uncle Wu Zhu. On the way back from the icy plains, the abundant yuanqi had already successfully healed Fan Xian's injuries. Although he knew that he still had no way of touching the boundary between humans and the sky, he believed that other than the emperor, there was no one else in this world who could threaten him. After traveling for another dozen days, they passed through the simple wooden sheds on either side of the road and numb-looking groups of refugees. The uncle and nephew in the carriage seemed to be walking in a desolate area similar to the snowy plains of the extreme north. The number of people gradually thinned. Occasionally, a light snowfall would fall, but it could not hide the deathly silence on either side of the road. Occasionally, a few rotting corpses could be seen on the side of the road. In the mountains in the distance, villages that had been burned into ruins could be faintly seen. This was originally a piece of fertile land. Even though it was blown by the North Sea wind, the fertile land still supported many people. However, there was only desolation at the moment. Most of the people had already retreated to the rear of Northern Qi. Those who were unable to avoid the flames of war had become sacrificial pawns for the obsession of unifying the world. As for the villages that had been burned and the people who had been killed by the side of the road, Fan Xian did not investigate deeply whether it was the work of the invading Qing army or the scattered Northern Qi soldiers. War had always been the original sin of humankind. In this world, how could there be a good war and a bad peace? On the deathly silent road, the air was dry and carried the smell of blood. It surrounded the black carriage. Fan Xian drove the restless horses with a wooden expression. He also did not turn his head to look at Uncle Wu Zhu's expression beside him. He knew that the armies between the two countries were currently gathered in the southwest of Yanjing on the plains to the north. After the Qing kingdom's northern camp won, they temporarily returned to camp to rest and reorganize because they feared Shang Shanhu, who had remained motionless. The deathly silence here was, on the contrary, relatively safe. However, the traces of the previous battle were already shocking to the eye. It was difficult for him to imagine what kind of hellish killing field this world would become once the Qing Iron Riders broke through the city of the Song Kingdom where Shang Shanhu was and headed north at full speed. In the entire world, it seemed that there was only the sound of the carriage rolling along the road. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and waved his whip. He avoided a small group of Qing riders patrolling on the other side of the river and entered Qing territory. Wu Zhu, who had been silent since leaving the temple, suddenly opened his mouth to speak. The world outside the temple is not very good. Chapter 760. The first snow fell on the ancient city walls of Shangjing. The black and green contrasted beautifully with the palace, but it did not bring with it a trace of a cold and enchanting aura. No one took pity on the thin layer of white snow on the square. The sky had just begun to brighten when more and more officials began to mercilessly step on it, crushing the white snow into mud. These officials had serious expressions and hurried movements. They did not have the leisure to admire the snow. Battle reports from the south flowed endlessly into Shangjing and came to the Hall of Governmental Affairs beside the royal palace. The Hall of Governmental Affairs was completely enveloped in a tense and oppressive atmosphere. Fortunately, it was not very chaotic. The sky was very dark. The northern Qi officials in the Hall of Governmental Affairs were arguing about something. Then, a low voice stopped everyone's argument and made the northern Qi cabinet recover its silence. In the silence, they quickly decided on a response. Concerning this battle, the northern Qi court had made many years of preparations. When the news of the Qing army's brazen attack came, no one was surprised. The methods of control and response during wartime quickly spread from the royal palace through the Hall of Governmental Affairs to this seemingly young but actually already lasting for thousands of years. In a short month, all of northern Qi was mobilized. A bright yellow royal carriage left the Hall of Governmental Affairs. The officials did not send it off from the back. Instead, they threw themselves back into the busy military and political affairs. In such a dangerous situation, if there were still officials who dared to show off their ability to flatter, they had to be careful of whether or not their heads would be chopped off by the furious emperor. The royal carriage came to the front of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. The northern Qi emperor, with a gloomy expression, swung his hand and jumped out of the carriage with a few thuds, scaring the eunuchs and serving girls beside him. He did not have the self-awareness to worry about his dragon body being injured. He turned around on the stone steps in front of the hall. The commander of the brocade guard beside the royal carriage, Wei Hua, and the other three important officials scolded in cold voices, "The Qing kingdom's internal strife has dragged on for a year. Now that things have come to an end, you are still in such a panic. Why do I keep you useless people?" A few important northern Qi officials felt a chill in their hearts. They knew that the emperor was not in a good mood. The battle report from last night, which had traveled thousands of li, stated that the Qing army in Yanjing had already begun to move. The Qi army stationed in Nanjing had been defeated again and again. Yet, the commander-in-chief, Shang Shanhu, was not in Nanjing. He was just hiding in that small city in the Song kingdom and had not made a move. After some thought, the officials did not know where the emperor's anger came from. Was it because of the panic of the officials in the Hall of Governmental Affairs? Was it because he was afraid of the Qing kingdom's hundreds of thousands of soldiers? Or was the emperor's suspicion of Shang Shanhu's deliberate silence? Wei Hua's body was very low. The present northern Qi court had long become an iron plate in the emperor's hands. No other faction dared to challenge the dignity of the royal family. Even Master Ku He's death 4 years ago did not change this trend. Furthermore, with a great enemy before them, no one dared to underestimate the authority of the northern Qi emperor. Wei Hua was a relative of the Empress Dowager and the emperor's trusted aide. He knew what the emperor's earlier words of internal strife in the Qing kingdom meant. To be able to delay the Qing kingdom's invasion for a year was completely because of the successive rebellions of the Qing Overwatch Council's last 2 masters. Wei Hua knew that regardless of whether it was the dead Chen Pingping or the unknown Fan Xian, why they would betray the Qing emperor, probably only the emperor knew the truth in all of northern Qi. Thus, he didn't say anything. Of the 3 officials, the old minister of war could no longer stand. He bravely stood out and tried to calm the emperor's anger. He was worried that the still young emperor would truly doubt General Shang Shanhu's loyalty. Presently, the Qing army was aggressively launching an invasion. If there was doubt between the ruler and officials, the result of this battle would be known without asking. As the nominal commander of the Northern Qi military, this official could not just watch as there was any problem between the pillar of the Northern Qi country, General Shang Shanhu, and the emperor, who used his maturity and steadiness beyond his age to calm the emotions of the officials in court. Thus, he prostrated himself on the ground and admonished endlessly. The Northern Qi emperor's expression gradually calmed. He waved his sleeves and had the officials withdraw to deal with the urgent military reports from the south. He himself led Wei Hua into the main hall. Beside the dragon chair in the main hall, behind the bead curtain, the Empress Dowager, who had not listened to politics behind the curtain for many years, was waiting for their arrival. In front of the bead curtain, the Northern Qi emperor bowed slightly. Wei Hua also bowed. The Northern Qi emperor's expression had completely calmed. Looking at Wei Hua, he asked in a cold voice, "Are there any new movements from the Qing court?" Wei Hua was slightly startled. As the head of Northern Qi's spy system, he was responsible for gathering intelligence from the court to the military. However, this intelligence had been delivered to the emperor's royal study early in the night. For a moment, he didn't know how to answer such a question. What exactly did the emperor want to ask? Pondering his words, Wei Hua furrowed his brows and said, "The Jingdo garrison of the Qing court is still Shifei, but Xiao Jinhua has been moved from Nanzhao back to the northern camp." Adding to the fact that Wang Zhikuan has been stationed in Yanjing for generations, the movement of the Qing generals is not surprising. The Northern Qi emperor furrowed his brows slightly and said, "Xiao Jinhua was once the deputy of the great prince of the Qing court. His performance during the Jingdo rebellion 4 years ago was mediocre. Additionally, his relationship with the great prince, so he was banished to Nanzhao by the Qing emperor. It is truly strange that he was moved back to the northern camp. What do you think of Wang Zhikuan?" Wang Zhikuan does not reveal himself. No matter how the Qing court changes, he still sits firmly in Yanjing. Based on the court's observations these years, the Qing emperor has kept him around in preparation for the current northern invasion. Wei Hua had no choice but to repeat the analysis of the Brocade Guard and the Ministry of War. The Northern Qi emperor was silent for a moment. He then suddenly asked, "Is Yi Zhong still in Jingdo?" Wei Hua replied, "Yes." The Northern Qi emperor stared at his face. A cold light shot out from his slightly narrowed eyes. "Are you sure?" Wei Hua's heart trembled slightly. In a low voice, he said, "I'm sure." "Then that's strange." The Northern Qi emperor glanced at the Empress Dowager behind the beaded curtain and shook his head. If the Qing emperor was truly prepared to finish this in one go, how could he still keep Yi Zhong in Jingdo? The Qing court had been tormented badly by Chen Pingping and Fan Xian these years. The generals who were truly good at fighting had either died or betrayed. The Qin family had all died, and the great prince had betrayed Dongyi. How could a mere Wang Zhikuan make the Qing emperor feel at ease? If this old man didn't want to personally lead the army, at least someone like Yi Zhong should be placed in the north. Wei Hua's heart jumped slightly. He also couldn't understand why the Qing court had arranged the deployment of generals this way. A war between two powerful countries would not be a small skirmish. Even if Wang Zhikuan had planned and prepared for this matter in Yanjing for 20 years, if the Qing military didn't bring out a truly powerful figure who could shake the country, how could they show their determination to the world and announce their tyrannical stance to Northern Qi? Northern Qi was not Dongyi. This country had succeeded the throne of the Wei kingdom. It had vast territory and a large population. The northeast plains were one of the granaries of the land. Although it had declined for a long time, under the sincere cooperation of the Empress Dowager and the Emperor, as well as valiant tactics, it had gradually shown its youth. Even with the Qing kingdom's strength and military power, if they wanted to attack Northern Qi, it would not be a goal that could be achieved in a short amount of time. Presumably, given the Qing emperor's powerful self-confidence, he would not make such an arrogant judgment. The beautiful main hall of the northern Qi royal palace immediately sank into silence. The emperor slowly paced his feet under the throne. His brows were furrowed into a pretty circle. He was analyzing what his powerful counterpart in the Qing kingdom wanted to do. The war had already begun. There was no baiting or probing. Hundreds of thousands of people had already paid with their lives. Since the war had already begun, why did the Qing emperor still not display a ferocious and wolf-like aura? On the contrary, he appeared to conform to convention. Furthermore, there was a sense of pettiness in this kind of convention. Wei Hua also sank into silence. His gaze followed the emperor's footsteps and moved endlessly. He was also calculating endlessly in his heart. Although, in his opinion, given the might of the Qing military, it didn't matter who the Qing court used as commander. He faintly felt a glimmer of surprise to see the emperor look at the choice of commander of the Qing army this way. Suddenly, he thought of General Shang Shanhu, who was far away from the Qi defense line in Nanjing and alone in the city of the Song Kingdom. His heart jumped slightly. He wanted to say something but was afraid the emperor would become angry again. He gazed at the blurry figure behind the curtain of beads and secretly gritted his teeth. Perhaps the Qing emperor is afraid of General Shang Shanhu's military strategy and is unwilling to attack with all his strength. However, the army is slowly pressing forward, forcing a gap in the Qi defense line under this enormous pressure. The Qing court will use this gap to leap forward. Before he finished speaking, the northern Qi emperor had already smiled. More accurately, a not-quite smile rose to his face. He looked at Wei Hua's face calmly but also full of pressure. The gap Wei Hua spoke of earlier was not actually a gap in the arrangement of northern Qi's military power. Rather, it was a gap in the hearts of the people. Just like how the old Minister of War had remonstrated on the snowy ground earlier, the northern Qi officials were all worried that General Shang Shanhu, the pillar of the court, would provoke the emperor's anger because the war in the south was not going well. The two countries had been at war for over a month. As the commander of the south, not only did Shang Shanhu not stop the Qing army's invasion, he had also left the Nanjing defense line and hid in the distance. He ignored dozens of urgent edicts from the court and watched as the Qing army advanced 100 li. In the northern Qi court, the emperor's anger had already been displayed without any concealment. Thus, there was the argument in the Hall of Governmental Affairs, the officials' guesses, the Minister of War's remonstrance on his knees, and Wei Hua's daring secret words. Unexpectedly, he did not receive the emperor's angry reprimand. The northern Qi emperor only looked at him with an indifferent expression and slowly said, "You underestimate me. Those people in the Qing court also underestimate me." Wei Hua's heart shook slightly. He didn't know where the emperor's words came from. "I have never doubted Shang Shanhu's loyalty." The northern Qi emperor's sword-like eyebrows rose. His voice was indescribably cold. "No, accurately speaking, I don't care whether or not General Shang Shanhu is loyal to me. As long as he is loyal to the court and this country, that is enough." Wei Hua's expression changed slightly. He didn't understand. He thought to himself that the emperor's anger, which worried the northern Qi officials greatly, as well as the scolding of Shang Shanhu coming from the royal palace, were all fake. If the Qing emperor truly thinks that I would make a mistake under his pressure, I can only say that the Qing emperor is far from as powerful as I imagine, the northern Qi emperor said calmly. The northern Qi emperor calmly said, "All of this was done for the southerners to see. It could also be said that it was done for you officials to see. If the Qing army truly dared to charge north, would they not be worried about General Shang Shanhu at the waist of their thin dragon and the power of Dongyi?" The northern Qi emperor said with slight mockery. "Would the southerners fall for my tricks? I don't believe it. I didn't think that these officials in court would jump in one by one." Wei Hua was silent for a moment. He then said, "However, Your Majesty's anger is enough to intimidate the officials. I am only worried that some officials in court will misjudge your Majesty's edict and implicate the soldiers on the front lines. War was always about logistics. The general bathed in blood at the front while the officials played with the emperor's heart at the back. It was often like this in the world. The northern Qi emperor's expression didn't change. Looking at Wei Hua, he said, "That is why I asked you to come today. Those who follow my orders these days and submit memorials attacking General Shang Shanhu's subordinates will all be expelled from court." Wei Hua's heart jumped. With a great enemy in front of them, was there going to be another upheaval in the court? "I know what you are worried about. Don't worry too much. The dangerous situation is already set. This is not the court of the past. If these useless people who only know how to think about me are captured, then they are captured. Who would dare to say another word?" The northern Qi emperor sat on the dragon chair and turned his head to glance at the bead curtain. He saw his mother behind it nodding slightly. Sitting up straight, he said with a dark expression, "From now on, any official who dares to speak ill of the general will be beheaded. Anyone who causes trouble on the front lines will be beheaded. You are not bad. The Minister of War is also not bad." The northern Qi emperor looked into Wei Hua's eyes. "If, at this time, you still don't speak up for General Shang Shanhu, I'm afraid I will have to behead you. When a country is about to fall, I do not keep useless people or idle people." Wei Hua's body trembled slightly. Only now did he know that the emperor had probably completely opened his heart to General Shang Shanhu a long, long time ago, which was why he could face the tense situation so calmly. However, with this, who in the entire northern Qi court could control Shang Shanhu far away in the south? If Shang Shanhu truly had disloyal thoughts, do you know how to lead an army and fight? The northern Qi emperor suddenly asked with slight mockery. "I don't know military affairs. I can't either. Since it is so, things like fighting have to be left to people who know how to do it. Since I have used Shang Shanhu, I will continue to use him without hesitation," the northern Qi emperor calmly said. "From today onwards, the military and civil affairs of the 7 counties in the south will all be under General Shang Shanhu's command. Gather the power of the entire court to help General Shang Shanhu resist the enemy. In a moment, send down the edict." For some reason, Wei Hua stared in a daze and somewhat rudely at the young emperor in front of him. He suddenly felt his body heat up. His originally fearful emotions became unusually calm and determined. He knelt on one knee and replied crisply, "As you wish." Wei Hua withdrew from the royal palace. He didn't know what kind of waves the emperor's edict, which gave 1/3 of the power of the northern Qi court to Shang Shanhu, would bring. The northern Qi emperor, who had just issued the edict, was unusually calm. He looked coldly at the thin layer of snow outside the palace without a glimmer of fear. Everyone feared the Qing army's valiant and unparalleled battle power. However, the northern Qi emperor was not afraid because he had Shang Shanhu. Furthermore, he dared to use Shang Shanhu more thoroughly than any other ruler. Although he didn't know much about military affairs, he knew that the vast war between the two countries was, in the end, a competition of national power. As long as the northern Qi court didn't make any mistakes, no matter how powerful the invaders in the south were, they would not be able to destroy northern Qi in a few short months. In the end, everything needed time. The northern Qi emperor was still young, but the powerful ruler in the south was already old. The northern Qi emperor could keep the Qing emperor waiting, but the Qing emperor himself did not want to wait for too long. The northern Qi emperor narrowed his eyes slightly. There was still a question in his heart that he could not get rid of. If the Qing emperor truly did not want to keep him waiting, why did the battle in the south appear so cold and tangled? Was the Qing emperor worried about Shang Shanhu, Dongyi, or something else? He should be almost at Jingdou, right? The beaded curtain moved slightly. A girl wearing a flowery, cotton-padded jacket walked out from behind the curtain, supporting the Empress Dowager. The Empress Dowager looked warmly at the northern Qi emperor. She couldn't help but feel a powerful sense of satisfaction in her heart. With a son like this, or rather, with a daughter like this, what else was there to ask for? The Northern Qi Emperor turned around and looked at Haitang Duoyao wearing the flowery, cotton-padded jacket. He smiled warmly and said, "Ant disciple, if you could bring heavenly soldiers and generals from the temple, why would I need to suffer so much?" Haitang slowly shook her head and didn't say anything. She thought to herself, if the emperor knew that the support he wanted the most in his life had been destroyed by her and 13th Wang, what would he look like? Remember what Fan Xian told you before. This world is theirs and ours. In the end, it is ours. The Northern Qi Emperor seemed to have thought of something. He suddenly opened his mouth and calmly said, "I still don't know where his confidence comes from. Faced with the dangerous situation in the south, I can faintly grasp this feeling." Haitang Duoyao was silent for a moment. She then said, "When he was in Jiangnan, he also said that we are the sun at 6 or 7 in the morning. The Qing Emperor is just a setting sun." The Northern Qi Emperor furrowed his brows slightly. It was as if even he didn't believe this judgment. The calmness on his face was actually mostly faked. He wasn't sure if the power of the entire country was in Shang Shanhu's hands. Would it be enough to temporarily stop the Qing Emperor's steps toward unifying the world? No matter how much of a genius Shang Shanhu was on the battlefield, in the end, he was only one person. The Empress Dowager, who had maintained a warm silence, suddenly laughed and said, "Looks like this setting sun, can only go hold my granddaughter." A wave of laughter finally rang out from the oppressive Northern Qi royal palace. The Northern Qi Emperor looked at Haitang and was silent for a moment. He then said, "Come with me to see Hongdofan." In the royal palace of the Qing kingdom in Jingdo, a setting sun hung in the western sky. The weather was still warm, and the twilight was like blood. It reflected off the red palace walls and bright yellow glazed tiles of the royal palace, making it seem like it was about to burn. The Qing Emperor, with a slightly tired and haggard expression, lay on a reclining chair in front of Taiji Palace. His fingers slowly combed the fur of a large, fat white cat. The fat cat seemed to enjoy the service of a powerful ruler. It lay lazily and occasionally turned its body, moving its soft abdomen close to the tips of the Qing Emperor's fingers. Of course, the fat white cat did not know how terrifying the Emperor's fingers were. A military general stood silently in the dusk, standing very close to the Emperor. He didn't say a word. He only looked at the white cat under the Emperor's command and the two fat cats stretching lazily behind the wooden chair. He couldn't help but feel that it was absurd. These three cats were yellow, black, and white. They all looked unusually fat from being raised. However, the palace rarely kept these small pets. No one knew how these seemingly ordinary cats had obtained the Emperor's favor. None of the emotions in his heart showed on the general's face. Even if a 2-year-old baby died in front of him, he would not be moved in the slightest. Furthermore, he was not a brute who only knew how to fight. Before he returned to the capital and entered the palace, he had already found out enough information. These three fat cats belonged to the Fan Manor. They had been raised by Princess Chen since they were young. At some point, she had brought them into the royal palace to play with the Emperor. The Emperor had kept these three cats until now. They seemed to be just three cats, but in the eyes of this general, he always felt that this seemed to represent a deeper meaning. However, he did not dare to ask, nor did he have anyone to ask, because no one in this world knew whether that person was dead or alive. The Qing Emperor pulled back his gaze from the sunset clouds and glanced at the general. He said, "That kid in Northern Qi is only acting for you to see. The court raises so many people in the Bureau of Military Affairs. Are they doing nothing?" It was impossible to tell how old this general was because his gaze was clear and cold. He seemed very young, but his face was full of hardships. After thinking for a moment, the general straightforwardly said, "On the battlefield, we use direct tactics and surprise to win. No matter how cunning Shang Shanhu is, as long as your majesty gives the order, the lives of the 3 armies of the Iron Riders of the Qing Kingdom will not disappoint your expectations. As for the matter of using troops, your majesty can decide on your own. There is no need for the Bureau of Military Affairs to do more useless work. These words were not flattery. A flattering official would never say such harsh words. Rather, it was true. This general had great faith in the emperor's military abilities and naturally sighed with emotion. Northern Qi has retreated again and again with the intention of retreating to the front line in Nanjing, using distance to exchange for time. That kid wants to waste time with me. A disdainful smile rose to the corners of the Qing emperor's lips. Shang Shanhu has his hand on the waist. It is indeed brilliant. However, the situation is as such. As long as this nail is pulled out, who can stop my army from heading north? The north needs a commander. The Qing emperor closed his eyes and allowed the blood-like dusk to envelop his thin face. Wang Zhikuan has been raised for 12 years. He has become somewhat blunt. To pull out this nail, Shang Shanhu, he must pass through Dongyi. Although I have not sent down an edict, it is clear that Governor Wang is afraid of the 4,000 Black Knights and the 10,000 soldiers in the boss' hands. If he is so restrained, how can he succeed? Immediately after, the Qing emperor glanced at the young general and furrowed his brows slightly. You have just returned from the grasslands. You are not clear on the matters of the Bureau of Military Affairs. Don't always argue with your father. As a son, this is improper. For some reason, the topic had turned in this direction. The general's heart chilled. He lowered his head and agreed. The Qing emperor stared at his face and slowly said, "Don't count on me sending you to the north to pull out the nail. You don't have enough experience. Most importantly, after entering and exiting the grasslands, you have honed your ruthlessness. However, your craftiness and patience are still lacking. You are not a match for Shang Shanhu." The general abruptly raised his head. A glimmer of dissatisfaction appeared on his face. "Yi Wan, you are still too inexperienced," the Qing emperor slowly said. "The Hu people of the grasslands are not as cunning as the people of the Central Plains. You have entered deep into the grasslands in pursuit of the chief's court. Your courage is commendable. Have you thought about why the 7,000 Northern Man Iron Riders are still unable to come into contact with the court? If the court met up with the 7,000 Man Riders on the snowy grasslands, would you still be able to escape back alive?" This young general was one of the rising stars of the Qing court. He was the son of the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Yi Zhong, and the commander of the Qingzhou victory, Yi Wan. After the Qingzhou victory, Yi Wan had led 4,000 Qing elite Iron Riders in pursuit of the remaining soldiers of the chief's court. He had earned a fearsome reputation on the grasslands. In the end, he had returned alive from the grasslands. Although there were only 800 of the 4,000 Iron Riders left, such an achievement was a remarkable matter in any of the Qing kingdom's military operations. However, the Qing emperor's light word struck a certain corner of this young general's heart. It also startled the faint doubt in Yi Wan's heart. Why was it that during the months of dangerous pursuit, Chief Su Bida's remaining soldiers of the court were still unable to make contact with the 7,000 Man Riders? Yi Wan's heart trembled slightly. He looked at the emperor's face, which was gradually showing signs of age. He wanted to seek an answer. Although Fan Xian took Haitang Duo to the temple, he still did not forget to set up a contingency plan on the grasslands, the Qing emperor said with an indifferent expression. Martial arts are always outside of poetry. Victory and defeat are also outside of the battlefield. When you understand this, the commander of my northern expedition will be you. Yi Wan stood silently by the emperor's side. His heart felt slightly heavy. Victory and defeat in this world is actually outside of the battlefield. Within a year, if Fan Xian dies, I will have won. If I die, the people in this world who do not like me will have won. It was as if the emperor was narrating the matter of someone else. His fingers tightened gently and lifted the fat white cat into his arms. He gently combed its fur meticulously. Chapter 761. Tomorrow, I will only write 3,000 words. I have to slow down because I don't know how to write anymore. Hearing the emperor's words, the expression on Yuan's face did not change. His slightly lowered head just happened to hide the strange light in his eyes. In his youth, this powerful figure who had abruptly risen in power in the Qin kingdom had fallen out with his father and traveled all the way from Dingzhou to Nanzhou. If it were not for the secret care of the man on the throne from the royal palace in Jingdou, and if it were not for the steady willpower he had developed through these years of suppression, how could he have been suppressed all this time and finally exploded violently? It was precisely this kind of experience that allowed Yuan to possess a powerful ability to control himself. Earlier, when the emperor pointed out that he was not a match for Shang Shanhu, a glimmer of dissatisfaction appeared on Yuan's face. This glimmer of dissatisfaction was actually purposely revealed. It was not difficult to accept that he was not a match for the famous general Shang Shanhu. However, he was, after all, a leader of the new generation of the military that the emperor thought highly of. If he appeared too wooden and lost the vitality and competitiveness that a young person should have, it would probably not be easy to deal with. Hearing Fan Xian's name, the strange light in Yuan's eyes came from the bottom of his heart. It was not only because the emperor had pointed out earlier that part of his great achievements on the western Hu grasslands was because of Fan Xian's secret help. It was also because Yuan had shockingly discovered that the emperor's words earlier had raised Fan Xian's life and death to a position completely equal to the emperor's life and death. The entire world knew what kind of person Fan Xian was. Although Yuan was often on the front lines in Nanzhou and basically did not participate in Jingdou matters, the relationship between the Yi manor and Fan Xian was complicated. How could he not secretly understand the young powerful official who had successfully changed his sister's personality, the major figure who, in a few short years, had lit up the Qin kingdom's sky like fireworks? Yuan had suppressed himself for many years and watched the world from the sidelines for many years. He had his own bearing and self-confidence. He had never thought that he would be any less than those rising figures under heaven. However, the emperor had long placed him quietly in an outer county, so he lacked a stage. This stage had already appeared under his feet. After the Qingzhou victory and the subsequent blood-soaked pursuit, he had begun to blossom with dazzling brilliance. However, each time he thought of Fan Xian's name, he always felt strange. It was not jealousy or envy. Rather, it was a faint coldness. Yuan had coldly watched Jingdou for many years and always felt unable to see through Fan Xian. After thinking it carefully, there was admiration, wariness, sympathy, and disdain. It was unusually complicated. Even so, Yuan still did not think that Fan Xian was a major figure who could shake the world. He thought it was because he believed it. To be it. He believed it. He believed it to be. He believed it to be. After the 4 great grandmasters had left, apart from the 2 sovereigns of the north and the south, no one else should be able to stand in that position. Do you think I have to raise to him? That is true pride. Yuan sternly accepted the lesson. In the dusky light, he bowed sincerely to the emperor. The emperor narrowed his eyes. Under the dim light, the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes added a sense of age. In a slow voice, he said, "There are many people in this world who can escape my control. However, there are very few who can stand against me calmly without moving or falling into chaos. Naturally, you do not see Nji as clearly as I do." These words were true, but they were also somewhat vague. During the winter snow at the beginning of the year, Fan Xian had acted wantonly and violently in Jingdou. In one day, he had killed all the officials of the He faction, shocking the court and the world. He had entered the palace to carry out an assassination and had been branded a rebel. What confused all the officials and caused all the rumors in the tea houses to lose their direction was that the Qing court had indeed spent a great deal of effort to hunt down Fan Xian and the assassin who had entered the palace to carry out the assassination. However, they had never acted against the power Fan Xian had spread around. The old officials of the Overwatch Council who had clearly participated in the case of killing the He faction in Jingdo were not even tried. They were only dismissed in large numbers. The power of the Fan faction in the Jiangnan area also did not receive the pressure of the royal palace. The emperor, who had always been ruthless and resolute, seemed to have lost the heart of an emperor he had always maintained when facing Fan Xian. He appeared overly gentle and benevolent, even to the point of being muddle-headed. No one dared to criticize the emperor, but many people were doubting him. Why did the emperor show mercy to the deranged Fan Xian's rebel faction? Did this matter truly have a background that could not be revealed? After Yuan returned from the grasslands with great difficulty and learned of the aftermath of the Jingdo chaos, he was also shocked and confused. The reason it was like this was because none of the important officials knew that the emperor and Fan Xian had talked for an entire night in the royal palace that snowy night. It was not that the emperor did not want to get rid of the Fan faction. Rather, his heart was touched and he had no choice but to abide by the promise of a two-person battle with Fan Xian. If the court truly carried out a purge of the Fan faction, what the Qing kingdom was about to welcome would probably be the largest upheaval since the founding of the country. It had to be said that in the handling of this matter, the emperor lacked a sliver of the courage he had in his wild advance in the past and gained a bit of worry and gentleness. It had to be said that only Fan Xian could understand the emperor's thousands of generations of intentions and also hold the lifeline of the Qing kingdom tightly to force the emperor to take such a stance. In this world, the only person who could force the Qing emperor to put down the butcher's knife in his hand was Fan Xian. As long as Fan Xian does not die, my heart will not be at ease. The emperor's fingers that were combing through the white cat's fur suddenly froze slightly. He slowly closed his eyes and spoke to Yuan beside him. Yuan's heart chilled. He lowered his head and said nothing. "How is your practice of the flowing cloud release going?" the emperor asked coldly. Yuan's heart jumped slightly. He did not understand why the emperor had suddenly changed the topic and began to test his cultivation. He thought for a moment and replied sincerely, "I have just entered the door. 20 years ago, your father practiced the coffin breaker to the extreme but was unable to advance any further. Although Fan Xian is unusually hard-working, after learning the coffin breaker from your sister, it is clear that there is no way for him to make further progress. Uncle Liuyun's skills cannot be lost like this. Since you have entered the door, my heart is at ease." The emperor continued to close his eyes and said, "Even so, in the end, you are not a match for Fan Xian. If you meet him in the future, take 3 steps back." Yuan's heart jumped again. Although he was indeed not satisfied with being judged by the emperor to be inferior to Fan Xian, from the emperor's earlier words about Fan Xian not being diligent and the emperor not being at ease, Yuan had already guessed too much. To be able to make the emperor, who was as powerful as a god, use national affairs and war as the price to lure and kill him, he probably truly could not compare. Following this, a fierce and stubborn emotion rose involuntarily in Yuan's heart. The expression of the most dazzling general of the younger generation of the Qing army did not change, but he faintly longed to be able to have a face-to-face battle with Fan Xian in the future. The night gradually eroded the twilight and surrounded the layers of the royal palace, enveloping the ruler and official in front of Taiji Palace. The emperor slowly opened his eyes. The light in his eyes seemed to want to illuminate the entire royal palace in an instant. Eunuch Yao came to the side of the emperor's soft couch. He held a wooden tray in his hand. On the tray was a yellow silk cushion. On it were 2 items that looked like letters. Yuan was slightly surprised. He didn't know what this meant and unconsciously glanced at the emperor. "One is the essence of the martial method I cultivate. The other is a secret edict I left for you." The emperor's eyes were level as he casually said, within a year, if I die, the secret edict can be opened. If I do not die, then burn the secret edict. As for the essence of the martial method, if you can make progress, consider it some compensation from me to the Yi family. Yi Wan did not understand what compensation meant, but he understood the words, essence of the martial method. Even the weather-beaten and ruthless General Li, who had killed without blinking on the grasslands, couldn't help but be moved. His body trembled slightly. Without hesitation, he knelt in front of the emperor and kowtowed heavily. Yi Wan did not decline insincerely. He knew that the emperor had written his experiences as a great grandmaster in this letter. For him, it was, without question, a priceless treasure. The emperor's actions were naturally because he hoped that the Yi family would remain absolutely loyal to the royal family in his hands. This kind of trust made every inch of Yi Wan's skin begin to tremble. A few days ago, I made you the martial tutor of Chengping. Since this is so, you should visit Xiaofan Palace more often. The emperor did not seem to care at all. Earlier, he had casually tossed the essence of the tyrannical martial method to an official. It was as if he was not worried about Yi Wan's loyalty to the royal family. The mental blow Yi Wan had received when he saw the emperor was too great. His face was slightly pale, but it did not affect his thinking and judgment. From the emperor's words, he immediately understood the meaning. The bloodline of the royal family had withered. The great prince had not rebelled, and his army was far away in Dongyi, contending with the court. The second prince and crown prince had long died tragically. After Fan Xian's rebellion, his whereabouts were unknown. No one knew whether he was dead or alive. Although Consort Mei in the palace seemed to be about to give birth, the only person the court officials faintly saw as the heir was the third prince, Li Qingping. Ever since the emperor had been injured at the beginning of the year, his health had not improved. Although his recovery was faster than that of a normal person, he always appeared tired easily. He had less control over court matters than in previous years. Fortunately, Hu the scholar and Pan Ling the scholar were in charge of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, so there were no problems. However, 3 months ago, the third prince, who had been under house arrest in the palace for half a year, had suddenly been ordered by the emperor to attend a lecture in the royal study. During this month, the third prince had begun to look over memorials on the emperor's behalf. This allowed the entire Qin court to guess the emperor's intentions. The emperor had made Yi Wan a martial tutor. Now, he had secretly given him a secret edict, secretly given him the martial method, and ordered him to be closer to the third prince. Without asking, one knew what he meant. Yi Wan was shocked and grateful. He prostrated on the ground and kowtowed again. Go. Remember what I said today. The emperor gazed at the increasingly dark eaves of the palace and narrowed his eyes slightly. Slowly, he said, particularly that line. Of my sons, Anji is the most ruthless. If he truly survives, you must take 3 steps back in front of him. Yi Wan's brows furrowed slightly. Suddenly, a glimmer of anger surged out of nowhere. This anger was not because the emperor had told him to take 3 steps back when he saw Fan Xian. Rather, he felt that Fan Xian was truly treasonous, disloyal, and unfilial. He was not an official or a son. He was not a thing. However, he didn't say anything. After bowing solemnly again, he followed the long corridor toward the outside of the royal palace. As he walked, Yi Wan's shoulders felt heavier and heavier. His mood also grew heavier and heavier. For one, he knew the emperor had given him a heavy burden. For another, he had suddenly smelled an inauspicious smell from the emperor's conversation. It was the smell of an old man. Yi Wan's heart trembled slightly. A difficult-to-suppress sorrow pressed down on his heavy figure as he walked through the royal palace. Without the emperor, there would not be the Yi Wan of today. The loyalty of the next master of the Yi family toward the Li royal family had never wavered. However, in this moment, he felt that the emperor seemed to be entrusting an orphan to him earlier. Why was this? Why was this? Although the emperor was old and tired, he was still powerful. Why would he say such things and make such arrangements? If the emperor truly died and the third prince took the throne, given the relationship between Shufang Palace and the Fan Manor, would the Qing court not become the world of that treacherous official, Fan Xian? Yiwan only felt a chill pierce through his back into his brain. He didn't dare to make any more guesses. Raising his head, he coldly walked out of the royal palace. There was no light in front of Taiji Palace. It was still dark. The emperor did not look at Yiwan's slightly sorrowful background. He only stared coldly at the darkness in front of him. It was as if he wanted to find a fire that belonged to him in this darkness. After a long silence, the emperor suddenly opened his mouth and said, "In my life, I have given birth to a few sons. Who would have thought that I would be forced into such a wretched state by Nji in the end? Who would have thought that he would actually come back alive from the temple?" A cold light flashed through the corners of the emperor's eyes. He paused for a moment and then said, "In the end, I am the old man, and he is the son. How can there be a son who can defeat the old man in this world?" Accompanying him, Eunuch Yao broke out in a cold sweat. How could he respond to the emperor's muttering to himself like this? The emperor suddenly let out a desolate sigh. He looked at the royal palace walls that appeared particularly tall in the dark night. He looked at the not very bright imperial army lights on the walls and narrowed his eyes slightly. No one knew what he was thinking. After the assassination attempt in the royal palace, the emperor had never left the palace again. In the eyes of many officials, this was the emperor's habit. Some people thought that perhaps the emperor's body was not completely healthy, so he was recuperating in the palace. However, only he knew that the reason he did not leave the palace was because he did not dare to leave the palace. That day, the thunder above the royal palace had sounded. The black box that had been floating in the air and remained outside of the Qing emperor's control had dealt the heaviest blow to this powerful ruler. Although the blow this time was not fatal, it had successfully shattered this ruler's confidence. There were truly things in the world that could easily kill him. The emperor had always been afraid of that box. Now that he knew that the box was outside the royal palace, although it was not in Fan Xian's hands, it was in the hands of his enemy, how could he leave the palace? The emperor didn't know when the box would make a sound again, but he knew that Fan Xian had returned alive. Fan Xian had already returned. Where was Lao Wu? The emperor lowered his eyelids slightly. Guarding the lonely palace could allow his edict to spread throughout the world. However, this tall royal palace and long palace walls were also like a perimeter wall, imprisoning him in the depths of the palace. If Nji does not die, my heart will not be at ease. A stern expression slowly rose to the emperor's thin face as he spoke coldly. However, the old and haggard wrinkles did not flatten because of this dark and stern expression. They were like the bark of a withered tree, appearing irreversible and shocking to the eye. This was the second time the emperor had said these words today. Between him and Fan Xian, there were too many complicated past events, present grudges, and differences in ideals. It was inevitable that they would fight to the death. Even so, the Qing emperor greatly admired his most accomplished son. The more he admired him, the angrier he became. In his entire life, he had never wanted someone to die as much as he did tonight. Perhaps only when he discovered that Chen Pingping had betrayed him and had secretly betrayed him for many years would he be as angry as he was now. The Qing emperor had the way of a king in his heart. He rarely felt joy or anger. Once he fell into mortal emotions, he was still nothing more than a mortal. He looked at the dark palace with a complicated expression and thought of the box that had disappeared. He thought of Fan Xian and Lao Wu, who he didn't know where they were heading toward Jingdo. On the contrary, his earlier anger returned to absolute calm. The sound of hurried footsteps came from the long corridor behind the soft couch. Eunuch Yao angrily turned his head to look. He saw Eunuch Hongzhu, who had long returned to the royal study to work by the emperor's side, holding a lantern and walking over with a face full of joy. Chapter 762. Consort Mei did not disappoint her clan, Jingdo, or even the entire Qing kingdom, who feared the third prince, Li Qingping. She successfully gave birth to a child in the autumn of the 12th year of the Qing calendar. In the tense situation of the war in the north, it had to be said that the addition of a bloodline to the royal family was good news and a good omen. It was a pity that her birth was not very noble. Her home was on the small side. Otherwise, presumably, the entire Jingdo would be even livelier because of the birth of this little prince. The third prince, Li Qingping, had gradually grown up these years. In front of others, he had always displayed a steady, educated, and well-mannered side. Additionally, he was listening to politics in the royal study and had been personally taught by Hu the scholar. He should have been the only choice for heir. Consort Mei's birth should not cause too much of a disturbance. However, not all of the officials had forgotten the Baoyue brothel incident. On the surface, it was a battle between Fan Xian and the second prince, but the ones pushed to the front of the stage were the second master and the third prince. The second master of the Fan family had escaped to northern Qi and had yet to return. Although the third prince's role in this matter had been wiped clean by the palace, it could not be hidden from the eyes of most people. More importantly, everyone in the world knew that this prince had a close relationship with Fan Xian. It was extraordinary. Fan Xian only had a ruthless and cruel side to the civil official system of the Qing dynasty because of the incident of him killing an official in the street. No one wanted Fan Xian to have a day where he could rise again. Most importantly, there were too many clever people in the Qing officialdom. Although the emperor had not said it explicitly, after many years, he had chosen to once again choose beautiful women to enter the palace after purging the Overwatch Council. These people had long guessed the emperor's intentions. Thus, the addition of another bloodline to the royal family added a faint sense of mystery. The good news in the palace was not publicly announced. It was just that the omnipresent tongues had been sent out of the palace ahead of time. In one night, all of the officials knew of this matter. Some of the prudent officials were deeply worried, some were secretly excited, and some let out a breath. However, even more people became nervous. While the officials were in their manners thinking about what kind of words they should write when they went to court the next day, the emperor, who had gained a son in his old age, was not as moved as these outsiders. Hongzhu, the writing eunuch in the royal study, continued to kneel obediently beside the emperor's soft couch. His knees were aching from kneeling. Cold sweat flowed endlessly down his back. A long time had passed since the message had been sent, but the emperor had been lying silently on the soft mattress. He did not show any expression of joy. He did not even have the interest to get up and go to concubine Mei's bedroom to have a look. Hongzhu didn't know what had happened. He didn't know what the emperor was thinking in his heart. He was just blindly nervous. He didn't know that Fan Xian was still alive and was heading toward the Qing kingdom's Jingdo. Following his duty as a eunuch servant, he kowtowed again and carefully reminded the emperor if it was time to rise. The emperor waved his hand in annoyance. He did not get angry, but he did not rise. On the contrary, he said to eunuch Yao beside him, "Do you think I will have the chance to see this son grow up?" Eunuch Yao's heart jumped slightly. He quickly bowed and piled on a smiling face to say a lot of nonsense. It was nothing more than the emperor being in his prime and living for thousands of generations. A glimmer of tiredness flashed across the emperor's thin face. The corners of his lips twitched slightly in a mocking smile. No one knew whether he was mocking the people of the world or himself. If Qin Pingping was still alive, how would he respond to this question? It would probably be much more interesting than eunuch Yao. However, that old dog seemed to have died a long time ago. Looking at the unchanging night scene in the palace in front of him, he suddenly thought of the letter the second prince had left him a few years ago. He also thought of the last conversation he had with the crown prince and the words the crown prince had said. "Father, please be more merciful to the people who are still alive." Li Qingxian's voice seemed to still echo in his ears, making the emperor's heart tighten slightly. His brows furrowed slightly. Quietly, he sighed and said, "Who will be more merciful to me?" The next day, the officials, who were preparing to wantonly present congratulatory memorials to flatter the emperor, were stunned to learn a piece of news that shocked and panicked them. Consort Mei had given birth to a son. However, there was a great deal of postpartum bleeding. The royal doctors tried to save her for an entire night but were unable to save her. Unfortunately, she passed away and died in the palace. Fortunately, the little prince, who had lost his mother when he was born, was in good health. After the emperor's grief over Consort Mei's death, he ordered Imperial Consort Yi to raise him in Xiaofan Palace. Imperial Consort Yi was raising him in Xiaofan Palace. That meant that in the future, Imperial Consort Yi would be the little prince's birth mother. Thinking of this, the officials, who had been wondering who the dragon chair of the Qin kingdom would belong to, were stunned speechless. They all knew that the emperor's arrangements had basically eliminated the possibility of this little prince ascending to the throne. Consort Mei was already dead. The little prince no longer had any protection in the palace. The Mei family was also very weak. If he was raised by Imperial Consort Yi, how could he have a day of success? The midday sun shone down on the walls of the royal palace, adding a great deal of warmth to this autumn day. However, the warmth inside the palace was not sufficient, particularly in Consort Mei's bedroom. It was cold and quiet. The newborn little prince had long been taken away. The nannies and related serving girls had also gone with him to Xiaofan Palace. Other than the faint sound of crying, there was not a glimmer of joy. Consort Mei's body had already been tidied up. It lay quietly on the large bed and had not been moved. This delicate and pretty girl, who Fan Xian had once met, still did not escape the misfortune in the royal palace. Perhaps it was because she had lost too much blood, but her face was snow-white like frost. Under the midday sun, it reflected a cold and unresigned glow. Fan Xian had once sincerely wished for her to give birth to a princess. Unfortunately and pitifully, she still successfully gave birth to a prince. Fan Xian's original worry was that after the Prince Consort Mei gave birth to grew up, he would once again bring unease and bloodshed to the royal palace. Probably even he had not expected that Consort Mei would pay the price with her life right after the little prince was born. The midday sun shone as brightly as the royal palace. Why was it that when it shone on that pretty white face, it was still so cold? Fan Manor, Side Study. Fan Shunning and Fan Liang were taking an afternoon nap with Cece's company. The sunlight shone on the trees and flowers in the Fan Manor's garden. It painted a complicated light and shadow on the window of the study. Inside the study, Lin Wan sat by the desk with a serious expression. After a long silence, she finally couldn't resist sighing and said, "Consort Mei's life has been hard, but this is good. She can be given to Imperial Consort Mei to raise. In the future, there will be no more disturbances." There was only her and her sister-in-law, Fan Ruoruo, in the room. During this half a year, the two of them often entered the palace to keep the emperor, who was growing older by the day. They were familiar with the matters in the royal palace. They had even seen Consort Mei, who was as beautiful and proud as a snow plum, a few times and was no stranger to her. However, they had not expected that Consort Mei would die from a difficult birth last night. Fan Ruoruo was not a person of many words. Hearing her sister-in-law's sigh, she was silent for a long time before raising her head. Looking into her eyes, she lightly said, "If you want to blame someone, you can only blame her parents for insisting on sending her to that shameful place." This was something Yuan Chun had once mentioned in Story of the Stone. Lin Wan knew that Fan Xian had written it. However, she was an intelligent and quick-witted person. She immediately heard the meaning behind her sister's words. The tips of her brows furrowed slightly. The emperor's bloodline is thin. Furthermore, Imperial Consort Mei has always been in charge of the palace. You and I know her personality. It can't be, it couldn't be anything. Both of them knew that. Fan Ruoruo thought for a moment and then shook her head. Of course, Imperial Consort Mei is not that kind of person. However, I have taken Consort Mei's pulse a few times in the palace and heard the sound of the baby many times. On the 7th day of the new year, after she was stabbed by brother, she was particularly careful and took good care of herself. Her body is also stronger than when she first entered the palace. In my opinion, although it is her first child, it shouldn't be so troublesome. It is always easy for accidents to happen when it comes to childbirth, Lin Wan said with lingering fear as she thought of the time she gave birth to Fan Liang. Fan Ruoruo furrowed her brows for a long time and then slowly shook her head. I heard it was a natural birth. I still feel this matter is strange. It was silent in the study for a long time. Lin Wan looked at her and lowered her voice. But, this doesn't make sense. It indeed did not make sense. There had always been many shady things in the Qing royal palace, but no one dared to do such a truly terrifying thing. In particular, Consort Mei's dragon seed was something the emperor had only obtained when he was old. The palace had always been personally managed by eunuch Yao. Even Xiaofan Palace did not interfere to avoid arousing suspicion. Who could harm Consort Mei? Fan Ruoruo suddenly said in a quiet voice, Consort Mei's due date is later than originally calculated. Lin Wan's heart trembled slightly. She looked at her eyes in disbelief and asked, who would be so daring? Fan Ruoruo shook her head and replied, in the Forbidden Palace, the emperor stayed with her every day. Naturally, no one would have the daring to offend the dignity of the royal family. Now that I think about it, back then, Consort Mei was probably young and muddle-headed. She only asked for the emperor's favor and probably made a mistake. Fortunately, later on, it was a mistake that prevented any major trouble. Lin Wan sighed. I really don't know what she was thinking. She was young and didn't understand. It is still her father and brother's family who sold her into the palace for glory. I'm afraid this was the idea of her family, Fan Ruoruo smiled coldly. Her family is only a small one. Additionally, there hasn't been a consort in the palace for many years, so they probably don't know the taboo. How could they be so daring? Consort Mei's death has nothing to do with them. Hearing this, Lin Wan finally understood and guessed. However, she still didn't dare believe her ears. In a daze, she said, although it was a crime of deceiving the ruler, she had just given birth to a prince and didn't do anything rebellious. How could she have died for no reason? Who knows what the emperor was thinking in his heart? A faint worry rose between Fan Ruoruo's brows. It was just hard on the child who lost his mother right after he was born. In the Qing kingdom, many years ago, there was also a child who lost his mother right after he was born. However, he still grew up healthily and happily under his mother's legacy. However, it was clear that Consort Mei, who was shone coldly by the midday sun, could not be like Yi Qingmei, standing in the darkness and watching over her son. Chapter 763. What was written today was still the same. The murderous aura was gradually becoming apparent. The Qing kingdom had been very harmonious these days. A new prince had been born in the palace. This was a joyous event. As for how Consort Mei had died, no one dared to open their mouth and discuss it. The midwife in the palace had died because of Consort Mei's difficult birth and was buried with her. It was expected and expected. The Qing court was using troops in the north. The situation of the country was tense, and it was the day to unify the world. Who would be so daring as to say a few forbidden sentences? Were they not afraid that the internal court eunuchs and ascetic monks in the dark would report them? In just a few days, the matter of Consort Mei faded. Jingdo once again transformed into a bright moon, cool breeze, and deep autumn land. The battle in the north was still lingering. The winter snow gradually arrived, but the Qing kingdom's attacks did not weaken. They attacked straight north and were about to approach the Nanjing defense line that the northern Qi people had laid out for 20 years. Unfortunately, after Shang Shanhu, who had remained in the Song kingdom and obtained the full trust of the northern Qi emperor, he coldly suppressed his troops without moving. He stood firmly on the Qing army's path of advance, making the Qing military incomparably fearful. In the end, Shi Fei still went to the north. Because of the urgency of the battle, Jingdo felt a slight sense of solemnity. This old Yanjing general, who had once subdued the northern camp, had been sent to the north by the emperor to assist Commander Wang Zhikuan and be responsible for the northern expedition. Famous generals were like beauties. Presumably, when Shi Fei embarked on his journey, his heart was filled with lofty sentiments and lofty aspirations. With Shi Fei's departure, the position of commander of the Jingdo garrison became vacant again. It attracted the burning gazes of countless young and powerful figures in the military. However, the emperor's following edict immediately extinguished all hopes. Yuan formally left his staff work in the Bureau of Military Affairs. Other than his position as a martial tutor, he also took on the position of commander of the Jingdo garrison. No one dared to object to this appointment. There was not even the slightest bit of opinion. The great achievements Yuan had made in the western side of the empire this year had truly fallen into the eyes of the officials and commoners. No one could stop him from standing out. Decades ago, Yuan's father, Yizhong, had taken up the position of commander of the Jingdo garrison when he was very young. Now, the wheel of fortune had turned and it had once again turned to the son he did not like. In the eyes of outsiders, the so-called tiger son of a general family, the pillar of the manor, was nothing more than this. At noon in late autumn, the clear and cold sunlight landed on Yuan's plain light armor. The young general furrowed his brows slightly. He gently squeezed his horse's abdomen and slowly walked outside Jingdo's Zhengyang gate. He squinted his eyes and kept looking at the commoners that passed by him. He was like a falcon looking for its prey in the vast grassland. In reality, this was just his subconscious reaction to his true emotions. He did not have the extravagant hope of meeting Sir Fan Jr. here. He only longed to see that legendary figure. Although the emperor had strictly ordered that if he saw Fan Xian, he had to take 3 steps back, how could Yuan be willing? In the clear and spacious late autumn sky, the clear and cold sunlight turned into countless straight and curved rays of light. Yuan's eyes narrowed even more. A few wrinkles that did not match his age squeezed out at the corners of his slightly dark face. He silently thought of the conversation he had with the emperor that day in front of Taiji Palace. His emotions were unusually complicated. Why had he chosen to carry out the northern expedition in autumn? Was he not worried about the cold winter that was about to arrive? This was a question that the northern Qi ruler and officials did not understand. It was also the worry of the Qing officials. However, with the emperor's strict edict, the entire world had danced and warhorses galloped on the road to invade the northern court. No one dared to ask too much. The strangest thing was that they clearly knew that the timing for this battle was not right. Yet, not a single one of the important officials in the Bureau of Military Affairs that Yizhong led, the one who knew the most about war matters, chose to remonstrate with the emperor. Tens of thousands of soldiers have advanced wave after wave and stepped onto the path of no return just to force him to show himself. Yuan sat on his horse with his head slightly lowered. It was as if he wanted to avoid the not burning sunlight. A slightly pained smile rose to the corners of his lips. He didn't understand why the emperor thought so highly of Fan Xian. He also didn't understand whether or not it was right for the emperor to have the Qing kingdom soldiers pay such a heavy price in order to lure and kill Fan Xian. When General Yuan sighed in his heart, he didn't know that the person he wanted to kill, the person the Qing emperor worried about the most in this land, had already passed through the city gates and returned to Jingdo. However, the city gate the two of them had gone through was not Zhengyang Gate. The midday sun shone brightly at the western city gate. Among the busy stream of people going to and fro in Jingdo, there were two figures that did not draw much attention. One of them wore normal cloth clothing while the other wore a straw hat. Fan Xian, who had put on a small disguise, unconsciously turned his head to glance at Wu Zhu beside him the moment he stepped into Jingdo. The wide straw hat blocked all of the black cloth on Wu Zhu's face in the shadows. No one should have noticed anything strange. Many years ago, Yi Qingmei had brought the young-looking Wu Zhu to the Qing kingdom's Jingdo like they were on a vacation. She had walked past the Jingdo city gates guarded by Yi Zhong and beaten Yi Zhong into a pig's head. Then, she had begun to assist a man in beginning his magnificent life. Fan Xian had brought the indifferent Wu Zhu back to the Qing kingdom's Jingdo without a sound. They had avoided Jingyang Gate, which Yi Wan personally guarded, and merged into the stream of people like two ghosts, preparing to begin the end of that man's magnificent life. From here on out, it seemed to be a perfect cycle. When Fan Xian and Wu Zhu returned to Jingdo, the battle in the north was still continuing. A number of days had passed since Consort Mei's death. Although he was a rebel of the Qing kingdom and had been stripped of all official positions and power, he still had his powerful intelligence network. In an inn in Jingdo, Fan Xian closed his eyes and thought about the cause of Consort Mei's death. He analyzed his plans and gradually grew heavy. In the following days, Fan Xian disguised himself as the common green-clothed servant in Jingdo and wandered between manors, streets, and tea shops. He didn't go to find anyone he knew because he didn't want to be beaten and killed by tens of thousands of people. He was only carefully looking for something. He was looking for the chest, the heavy chest. Feng Shuotian's assassination attempt had failed and he had been surrounded by the Qing army in the square in front of the palace. He had heard the sound of the chest and knew that the emperor had almost died to that heavy sniper rifle. If he could find the chest, perhaps the rest of the matter would be much simpler. However, whose hands would the chest be in? This question should have been the simplest and clearest to ask Wu Zhu. Presently, Wu Zhu was just a pale and indifferent piece of paper. He didn't remember anything and didn't care about anything. He only unconsciously followed Fan Xian out of the temple and began to wander around the world outside the temple, experiencing and experiencing. During those days, for the safety of his family and the understanding he had with the emperor, Fan Xian did not return to the Fan Manor. He searched for traces near Zhaixing Tower and thought hard about who would have Uncle Wu Zhu's greatest trust, other than himself. However, his train of thought had sunk into the wrong area. No matter what, he did not think of that woman. Thus, this kind of search appeared hesitant and directionless. He wanted to cry out on the late autumn streets of Jingdo. After all, he was the common enemy of the entire Qing court. In Jingdo, which appeared peaceful and without the smell of war, but was actually beginning to seep with a solemn aura, the most important task was to survive and hide his tracks. He didn't even dare make contact with his old subordinates in the Overwatch Council, so this kind of search appeared futile. The present Jingdo was already different from the Jingdo of a year ago. The Overwatch Council had become the illegitimate child raised by his second mother, swaying in the bleak wind and bitter rain. If it were not for the fact that the emperor had not completely gone senile, the officials would have long suggested the emperor directly disband the Overwatch Council. In the past, Fan Xian had always thought that with the 3 treasures in his body, he could go anywhere in the world. Thus, no matter what kind of danger he encountered after his rebirth, he had never truly lost confidence. Even when facing Yi Liuyun's sword and the emperor's finger, he still felt that he was the most ruthless person in the world. His 3 treasures were the poisoned crossbow, the poisoned dagger, and Uncle Wu Zhu. Presently, Uncle Wu Zhu had become an idiot. The chest had also disappeared. What could he do? Fan Manor, Duke Lu Manor, King Jing Manor, Yen Manor, Prince Heching Manor, the Overwatch Council on Tianhe River, a yamen by the Supreme Court, a small manor in the south of the city, all of the places Fan Xian could have come into contact with had the court spies. A number of times, Fan Xian almost ran into the ascetic monks wearing the straw hats. Since he couldn't figure out where the chest was, then he didn't think about it. Fan Xian was such a ruthless person. Compared to that, confirming the emperor's current physical and mental state was the most important. Although there were intelligence reports gathered in his hands, he did not completely trust them. The emperor in the palace was best at enduring, lying, and killing. It was like this at Dong Mountain. It had been like this many times. Fan Xian didn't want to make a mistake because he knew the emperor would never give him another chance to make a mistake. Strangely, the emperor and Fan Xian could not completely sort out each other's emotions. However, once they thought of each other, their emotions would calm and cool down. All that was left was to kill. There was no need to say it to anyone or announce it to the sun and moon. Killing each other seemed to have become some sort of spiritual support for the two of them to live in this world. It had to be said that this was a rather sorrowful matter. In order to obtain the truest information in the palace, Fan Xian thought for a long time in the inn and chose the Yi Manor. The Yi Manor was a loyal family. Yi Zhong was the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, and Yi Wan was the commander of the Jingdo garrison. The emperor trusted them to the extreme, so he would not send spies to keep watch. In the present world, there were not many places that could stop Fan Xian from sneaking in. Thus, when the worried Yi Linger suddenly saw a green-clothed manservant appear like a ghost in front of her, her expression changed dramatically. However, this brave girl of a family of generals was not a weak woman. She did not call out to him. Instead, her expression darkened. She pulled out the knife at her waist and, without hesitation, chopped down. "It's me," Fan Xian said. A tired smile rose to the corners of his lips. "It's you?" Yi Linger looked in disbelief at his unfamiliar face and couldn't speak for a long time. She had not thought that this young teacher would still be alive and able to come back alive from the temple. After talking for a while, Fan Xian tiredly lowered his head. It looked like the emperor's health was truly failing. Furthermore, from Consort Mei's death and the royal family's arrangements for the little prince, his heart moved slightly. With unusual accuracy, he grasped the emperor's thoughts and emotions. It was a faint sense of old age. It looked like the powerful emperor had successively suffered heavy blows from his closest son and official. Not only his body, but even his spirit had sunk into the lowest period of his life. Why had the emperor chosen this time to begin the northern expedition? Was it because he felt that he didn't have much time left, so he needed to hurry? In order to knock the emperor off his divine altar, Fan Xian had not hesitated to use spears, swords, and people's hearts. He had used the shameless thoughts he had cultivated in 2 lifetimes to use the world as a threat and the people as a threat. Only then had he finally succeeded in creating the present situation. The emperor was old and had emotions. Naturally, he was weak. This was the situation he had been most looking forward to seeing. Why did Fan Xian not feel a glimmer of joy in his heart? Not only was Fan Xian not happy, on the contrary, he was perplexed. He sat in the chair in front of Yi Linger with both feet on the surface of the chair. His hands were wrapped around his knees, and his face was pressed against his legs. He silently sank into thought, giving off a feeling of unusual exhaustion. Yi Linger saw his posture. Her eyes lit up slightly and then quickly turned into a deep sorrow. She thought of someone. Perhaps it was because she thought of someone that she did not ask Fan Xian where the other person was. The sun gradually moved toward the west. A patch of twilight shone on the Yi Manor. Yi Wan stepped into the back garden with a heavy expression. Perhaps it was because of the tense battle in the north or because the entire Jingdo was on guard against the return of that person, the palace did not strictly order him to leave the capital and return to camp. On the contrary, the emperor had left an oral order for him to follow the yamen to investigate matters. His father, Yi Zhong, should still be in the Bureau of Military Affairs analyzing military reports and drawing up strategies. He would probably have to stay up all night. Yi Wan did not feel a glimmer of envy or resentment. He knew better than anyone that although the northern expedition had already begun, it could not end in a short time because there was still an important goal that had not been reached. It was precisely because Yi Zhong was not in the manner that Yi Wan's footsteps appeared lighter. His relationship with his father had always been poor. Otherwise, he would not have stayed in Nanzhao for so many years. Even the people of Jingdo had almost forgotten about his existence. However, Yi Wan and Yi Linger's relationship was very good. Perhaps it was because they had not seen each other for many years, but the brother and sister seemed particularly close. Yi Wan prepared to go to the back garden to see his sister, so he did not bring any subordinates or guards. However, the moment he entered the back garden, the first thing he saw was not his sister's figure. Instead, it was a green-clothed servant. The green-clothed servant bowed humbly with his back hunched and prepared to leave. However, Yi Wan narrowed his eyes. The moment he entered the garden, he had already noticed that there was something wrong with the position of this strangely ordinary green-clothed servant's feet. This was a very fine place. The green-clothed servant's feet appeared casual, but Yi Wan knew that as long as this person moved his back foot, his entire body would be able to rise. Of course, this was an ability that only aces of their level could have. Was he too vigilant? The cold light in Yi Wan's narrowed eyes gradually froze. He looked at the back of the green-clothed servant who brushed past him and suddenly asked, "Why did you come back?" The green-clothed servant's figure paused slightly and slowly stopped his steps. He then turned around with unusual calmness and looked at the young master of the Yi manor. With great interest, he asked, "Yi Wan. Even like this, you could see through me. Although it was because I was careless, you are indeed not bad." When Fan Xian unexpectedly ran into Yi Wan in the Yi manor, Wu Zhu, who had entered the capital with him, was wearing the large bamboo hat and strolling through Jingdo. When it came to the present Wu Zhu, Fan Xian no longer knew what words to use to describe his feeling of defeat. This forever 15-year-old young warrior covered in black cloth had not only lost his memory, he had even forgotten much of the knowledge of survival in this world. Fan Xian had stayed in Jingdo for many days. Wu Zhu had also stayed by the window of the inn for many days. Although the black cloth covered his eyes, Fan Xian always felt that he could see the desire and curiosity in his eyes. Wu Zhu still did not speak and remained silent like a pale walking machine. He only unconsciously followed Fan Xian's footsteps. Fortunately, Fan Xian was most skilled in dealing with idiotic children. De Bao was coaxed well by him, and Wu Zhu was no exception. Along the way, there were no major problems. However, the body that seemed to have lost its soul always made Fan Xian's heart ache uncontrollably. Thus, he no longer stopped Wu Zhu from leaving the inn and strolling. Truthfully speaking, he could not stop him. As long as Wu Zhu could remember the way back to the inn, it was fine. Fan Xian was also not worried about Wu Zhu's safety. In his opinion, there was no one in this world who could harm him. However, Fan Xian seemed to have forgotten that right now, Wu Zhu was like an ignorant and curious child. Even more troublesome was that Wu Zhu's brain did not have the slightest possibility of harming humans. Thus, the black-clothed Wu Zhu seemed to be at ease in Jingdo, but in reality, he was strolling dangerously. He did not attack and did not care about anything. He only watched through the black cloth, looking at this strange yet familiar city. Wu Zhu walked through the streets and alleys, looking curiously at the candied halls and listening to the people in the tea shops passionately discussing the war situation in the north. He walked through the long alley, crossed the Tianhe River, and came to the edge of the square of the royal palace. He tilted his head curiously and looked through the black cloth at the glorious front gate of the royal palace. For some reason, a thread of irrepressible irritation rose in his icy heart. Smack! A small stone smashed into his body, followed by many more. The children in Jingdo had no idea that the man wearing the straw hat was the most dangerous existence in the world. They desperately smashed him with stones. Throwing idiots. Throwing idiots. Wu Zhu did not move at all, allowing the children to throw stones. He looked at the front gate of the royal palace and suddenly said to himself, "This seems to be called the Meridian Gate. It's used to kill people." Chapter 764. I don't want to say anything. A faint sense of disappointment is beginning to creep in. Am I not a petty bourgeois? In the back garden of the Yi Manor, Yiwan's pupils constricted slightly as he stared unblinkingly at the green-clothed servant. He had not thought that after he had exposed his location, the other party would have the courage to turn around and face him directly instead of choosing to leap over the wall and leave at the first opportunity. Fan Xian calmly turned around. There was only calmness in his eyes. There was not a glimmer of any other emotion. He looked at the unfamiliar young general in front of him and immediately identified the other party's identity. There were only two men in the Yi family, old and young, who could come to Yi Ling'er's little garden without being announced. Since the other party was not Yi Zhong, then it was General Yiwan, who had risen to prominence this year and received the respect of countless Qing soldiers. If this had been a year ago or even longer ago, Fan Xian and Yiwan, the two most valiant young men in the Qing kingdom, might have developed a feeling of mutual appreciation and uncontrollably affection. It would be just like how Fan Xian and the great prince had at first had a grudge. In the end, they grew closer because of their personalities. However, it was impossible now. Presently, Fan Xian was a traitor of the Qing kingdom and an unpardonable criminal. Yiwan was a rising star general and the emperor's most trusted figure of the younger generation. Most importantly, Fan Xian had experienced a long journey through the snowy plains. He seemed to have seen everything in the world lightly. There was only calmness and indifference in his eyes. This kind of calmness and indifference represented powerful confidence. In Yiwan's eyes, it was a powerful disdain. The glimmer of dissatisfaction and anger hidden in his heart for a number of days immediately took over his entire body. This anger did not make his judgment deviate at all. It only made him even more calm. Fan Xian is here. Yiwan roared. Although he very much hoped to have a fair battle with Fan Xian, he would not make such a mistake. For the Qing court, Fan Xian was like a fishbone that could not be swallowed. Being able to capture him or kill him was what Yiwan wanted to do the most. The emperor had once said that if this person did not die, it would be difficult for the emperor's heart to rest. As an official, Yiwan had to suppress his pride. Thus, after he let out a roar to inform the soldiers outside the garden, he immediately chose to retreat. Using such a weak stance, he blocked Fan Xian's path of retreat. He did not mind using such a humiliating method to buy more time. As long as the soldiers arrived and Jingdo sounded the alarm, Yiwan did not believe Fan Xian could escape. Fan Xian also understood this. When Yiwan opened his mouth coldly, he had already leapt forward. Fan Xian pounced forward like a streak of smoke. Although it was gentle, the gentle shadow carried a heart-chilling tyranny. It tore through the cold autumn air and the peace of the garden. The powerful and tyrannical aura that pounced toward him made Yiwan, who had retreated 3 steps, narrow his eyes. It was as if he felt the wind in front of him piercing his bones like an icy knife. His heart was shocked, but his expression remained calm and unchanging. Without time to draw his knife, his hands crossed in front of him. His left fist and right palm intersected. In a very short time, he valiantly formed a hand bridge and sealed the front. Once the hand bridge appeared, it was like a metal chain crossing a river. A murderous and powerful aura rose spontaneously and blocked in front of Fan Xian's punch. It made the tyrannical punch like a floating log on the river. Although it came with ferocious momentum, it did not give off the feeling that it could shatter the metal chain. Fan Xian was in midair, but his eyes had already narrowed. He had practiced the Yi family's coffin breaker technique for many years and was very familiar with the Yi family's martial arts. However, Yiwan had retreated 3 steps and appeared weak. Unexpectedly, the hand bridge formed and a thick wall appeared in the air. Such a powerful and exquisite hand seal was definitely not part of the coffin breaker technique. Was it Yi Liuyan San's Ho? Had this young general learned the ultimate skill left behind by a great grandmaster? Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly, but his hands did not slow down at all. The aura emanating from the hand bridge in front of him was too powerful. He knew that his tyrannical punch might not be able to break through the other party's defense. The power of Flowing Cloud San's Ho lay in the impermanence of its true form. Once the other party's hand bridge sealed his own, the following changing counterattack would probably be faster than his. More importantly, Flowing Cloud Sancho's counterattack was like the floating clouds on the horizon. It was difficult for anyone to catch its true form. Even if Fan Xian was not afraid, if he was actually sealed by Flowing Cloud San's Ho, he would probably not be able to retreat for a moment. It was clear that Yiwan wanted to capture or kill him. He would not mind delaying him and then joining forces with others to attack. With a whoosh, like a magic trick, a black, delicate crossbow bolt suddenly shot out from Fan Xian's sleeve. It surpassed the speed of his fist and shot into Yiwan's hand bridge with a thud. This move was very sinister. Fan Xian had always been a sinister person. However, this thud clearly had a problem. The delicate poisoned crossbow bolt seemed to have shot into wood. It only left a small red dot on Yiwan's calloused but still pure white hands before it fell down dejectedly. After Yi Liuyan San's Ho had been practiced to the extreme, he could catch Sigujian's ruthless strike. His nephew, Yiwan, clearly did not have such a realm. Faced with Fan Xian's sinister crossbow bolt, he appeared unusually valiant. After the black light, there was a streak of bright light. With a hiss, Fan Xian's tightly clenched fist suddenly opened. A black dagger stabbed down viciously. Yiwan's expression remained calm. He did not move at all. His two hands, one fist and one palm, became soft in front of the black dagger. They turned into two balls of clouds in the sky and gently stuck to the side of Fan Xian's black dagger. It made it seem as if Fan Xian's thousands of tyrannical forces had plunged into a swamp of cotton and did not raise a single ripple. No matter how strong he was, this was Fan Xian's first time encountering the Yi family's true bright moon, great river, and cool breeze. He was unable to advance an inch. Fan Xian's right foot stomped heavily on the stone floor between the two of them. With a crack, the stone floor shattered like a spiderweb. His expression did not change. The index finger of his right hand curled cleverly. Using a small trick, the black dagger followed the tip of his finger and drew a sharp arc. The two of them were already very close. Yiwan had nowhere to retreat. Fan Xian had to break out. Both of them had raised their cultivation to the peak in an instant. The black dagger, which carried a mournful force, slashed down. Yiwan's hands suddenly turned into two old trees. The leafless branches opened up one by one and swiftly collided with the black dagger dozens of times. However, not a single wound was left on his withered fingers. In this instant, the corners of Fan Xian's lips twitched. He smiled slightly. There was only calmness in his smile, as well as the confidence this calmness represented, as well as the power this confidence represented. The black dagger at the tip of his finger slashed down dozens of times. They were all blocked, but he used the momentum to pull the dagger back. His left hand, which had been hanging calmly by his waist, clenched tightly into a fist. He did not give it any exquisite angle or incorporate any technique taught by a great grandmaster. He only smashed it forward viciously. With a muffled bang, Fan Xian's left fist smashed viciously into the hand bridge that Yiwan had rearranged in an instant. The battle between the two powerful young men had already progressed to a contest of martial cultivation foundations. Fan Xian abandoned all external emotions and techniques. Completely unreasonable, he forcefully fought the Jinqi in his body against Yiwan's. The fist and palm collided without any hindrance. Yiwan's expression darkened slightly and then paled in an instant. His left foot stepped behind him and his hands blocked in front of him. His entire body formed a beautiful arrow-shaped figure. His back foot was like a nail nailed firmly into the rock. His two hands were like a metal plate, blocking any attack that came charging at him. Fan Xian's body remained relaxed and casual. It was as if he had thrown out a punch without thinking in his anger. His 2 feet were still in place, and his body was still not in a proper shape. A powerful ripple spread out from the bodies of the 2 people in the garden. With a whoosh, the autumn wind kicked up, sending up countless pieces of rock and fallen leaves. Fan Xian's eyes lit up as he stared at Yuan's dark and stern face, which was close at hand. It seemed that he had not expected the Zhenqi in Yuan's body to be so powerful. After consecutively sealing his 2 hidden attacks, Yuan was still able to block the tyrannical punch. He had been accumulating power for a long time. Just how did Yuan train such powerful and solid Zhenqi in his body? Had this person been training his spirit and willpower without sleep when he had been exiled to Nanzhao? Thinking of this, Fan Xian faintly felt some admiration for him. However, the sound of footsteps came from outside the garden. Fan Xian did not want to waste any more time. Fan Xian was slightly startled. He did not know that across from him, the shock in Yuan's heart was even more difficult to express. Yuan knew how powerful he was, but faced with Fan Xian's seemingly casual punch, he had the inauspicious thought that his hand bridge would be destroyed. The reason he had this thought was purely because Yuan was in the field and could clearly feel Fan Xian's strength, which was even more powerful and tyrannical than the legends. In this moment, Yuan finally understood where Sir Fan Jr.'s reputation had come from. He also finally understood why the emperor had ordered him to take 3 steps back the moment he saw Fan Xian. If Yuan had not taken 3 steps back earlier and set up his hand bridge first, given Fan Xian's ability to react to situations, his strength, and the ruthlessness of his attacks, he would probably have destroyed Yuan's state of mind with 3 consecutive attacks in an instant. He would not have given Yuan the opportunity to use the flowing cloud release hands. Was he truly not as good as him? Although Yuan's expression remained steady and calm, his heart was filled with a powerful impulse to carry out a final battle with the other party. Fan Xian did not give Yuan this opportunity. Although it was impossible for him to kill the other party in one move, he decided to leave an unforgettable impression on him and leave behind a satisfactory ending for this first encounter between the 2 of them that was destined to be passed down to future generations. Thus, Fan Xian's eyes grew brighter and brighter. The clothes on his body began to rustle and tremble in the autumn wind. A faint but endless yuanqi moved along the autumn wind, through the holes in his clothes, and along every inch of his skin. It began to pour endlessly into his body. Fan Xian closed his eyes, hiding the unusual bright light in them. With a muffled grunt, his left arm swelled up. His fist, which had lost all its momentum, spat out all of its strength. The dam made of sand and stone blocked thousands of li of the vast river water. The river water rose higher and higher, and the force of the water increased. Suddenly, the heavens were not on their side. It rained heavily. Countless raindrops scattered into the river. In an instant, a breach appeared in the dam. A large hall that was about to collapse was held up by countless thick and straight logs, barely holding up the existence of the palace. However, the earth began to shake. An energy that had not been there before but had suddenly appeared shook the earth and shook the foundations of the logs, causing them to fall one by one. The hall lost its support and collapsed with a bang. From the beginning, he had used the Yi family's flowing cloud sands hoe and the sealing hand gesture to form a hand bridge to successfully block Fan Xian's 3 consecutive attacks. Yuan did not feel any pride, even if he was facing the powerful Fan Xian. That was because he knew best how powerful he was. However, he suddenly felt that the bridge his 2 hands had formed had been destroyed. His body, the hall, was about to collapse. So, Fan Xian's power was above the legends and above his own judgment. A gust of autumn wind brushed past. The withered leaves that had been blown about by the two people's strength began to dance again. Amidst the dancing leaves, Fan Xian's unusually steady fist broke through the Yi family's flowing cloud. Sancho's hand bridged like breaking dry weeds and smashing viciously into Yuan's right chest. The autumn wind rose again, and the leaves flew again. There was no trace of Fan Xian in the back garden of the Yi family. There was only a pale-faced Yuan holding his chest and forcefully swallowing the mouthful of fresh blood that had surged to his lips. The bodyguards had finally charged into the garden, but they did not see any trace of the enemy. They only saw that the usually undefeated General Yi seemed to have lost. From the moment Yuan saw the green-clothed servant to the moment the bodyguards charged into the garden, only 10 seconds had passed. In these 10 seconds, the two important figures who would influence the future of the Qin kingdom had met for the first time in their lives and determined a victor. Yuan held his chest and forcefully calmed the almost boiling zhenqi in his body. Killing intent quickly returned to his eyes. In an icy voice, he said, "Inform the palace that Fan Xian has returned." With these words, the bodyguards finally knew who had defeated the general they saw as a god of death. Shocked expressions appeared on everyone's faces. Yuan slowly turned around and looked with narrowed eyes at the high wall that Fan Xian had jumped out from earlier. His emotions were unusually complicated. It was an emotion of anger and dissatisfaction. In the earlier battle, as an official, his first thought was to keep the other party here. Thus, from the beginning, he had adopted a defensive stance. His aura had fallen to a disadvantage, so he was dissatisfied in his heart. If the scene had been changed, perhaps it would have been much better. Fan Xian's last punch had been able to easily break through the bridge of his hand. Although it was impossible for Fan Xian's tyrannical zhenqi to have much destructive power after breaking through the flowing cloud release, being defeated and injured by the other party was an undeniable reality. In particular, the powerful zhenqi that had surged out of the punch at the end made Yuan understand one reality. He was indeed not a match for Fan Xian. Yuan never underestimated his enemies, particularly someone as famous as Fan Xian. However, he had not thought that the strength Fan Xian had demonstrated was more powerful than the legends, military intelligence, and his own predictions. A cough rang out. Yuan used the corner of his sleeve to wipe away the blood at the side of his lips. His eyes were icy cold and unusually angry. The reason for his anger was because why was life so unfair? Ever since he was young, he had traveled between the yellow sand and the barbarians in the south. His diligence in cultivation was second to no one else in the world. That was why he had his current superior 9th-level strength. However, it did not seem to be enough for Fan Xian. This was impossible. Fan Xian had not lived much longer than him. How could he have cultivated to such a realm? A genius? Could having a genius surpass his diligence? Fan Xian did not know of the anger of the young general in the Yi manor behind him. Even if he knew, he probably would not understand. He knew better than anyone that he was not a genius in martial cultivation. It was just that his luck was good. Furthermore, he was more diligent than anyone else. When all was said and done, he and Yuan walked the same path. However, from the moment Fan Xian was born, he had begun to cultivate the tyrannical martial method. From the first day he was alive, he began to fear death. No one in the world could compare to this kind of pressure and feeling. Thus, it created his strange realm. He had defeated Yuan but was unable to kill him. There was not a glimmer of pride in Fan Xian's heart. His confidence, based on his powerful strength, had already allowed him to transcend certain boundaries. In today's battle, he had used his strength to break through. It appeared simple, but it was a return to simplicity and a wonderful choice. He lowered his head and shook off the gradually rising commotion in Jingdo. Silently, he returned to the inn. He then saw the silent Uncle Wu Zhu. He was not looking at the scenery by the window. Instead, he had his head lowered as if thinking about something. When humans thought, God laughed. If Wu Zhu began to think, who would laugh? Fan Xian gently coughed and coughed up the bloody phlegm that had come out of his injury from Yuan's hand bridge earlier. Looking at Uncle Wu Zhu, he said, "He knows I've returned. I will enter the palace tonight." Although he knew there was not much meaning in saying these words, for some reason, Fan Xian was still used to telling Uncle Wu Zhu everything he did. It was just like that day and night in front of the snowy temple when he coughed up blood and talked. As expected, Wu Zhu did not have any reaction. He only lowered his head. Fan Xian's head also gradually lowered. The night gradually darkened. There was no light in the room in the inn. There was only darkness and two people. At the first glimmer of dawn the next day, the room in the inn was already empty. The unlit candles still maintained their delicate appearance. There were no sticky tears shed to mourn in advance the revenge that was about to begin and end. Not long after midnight, Fan Xian changed into a eunuch's clothes and slipped into the darkness of Jingdo. Before he left the inn, he gave Uncle Wu Zhu one last deep glance. He did not try to wake him or invite him to join in the conflict of human emotions. Wu Zhu also did not seem to mind his departure. He just waited alone until daybreak. The moment the sky brightened, rain began to fall in Jingdo in the depths of autumn and the beginning of winter. The icy rainwater pattered against the transparent glass windows and blossomed into flower after flower on the surface. It was rain, not snow, but it appeared particularly cold. The cold rain did not grow heavier. It only fell in strands, striking against the tiles of the private residences in Jingdo. In the small stone alleys and beside the little bridges and flowing water, a rich, slow, and beautiful melody rang out. All of the private residences in Jingdo bathed in the cold rain had windows. Ever since the palace treasury had revived, the price of glass in the court had plummeted. Most of these windows were made of glass. Thus, when the cold rain fell on the world, it would blossom into flowers of different sizes on the glass. Wu Zhu, covered by a black cloth, sat quietly by the window, looking at the rain blooming on the glass. After a long silence, he suddenly extended a finger and gently touched the glass. It seemed that he wanted to touch the beautiful flower outside the window but was helplessly separated by the glass. "This is glass." Wu Zhu suddenly broke the silence. Alone, he looked out the window. Without a trace of emotion, he said, "I made it." Wu Zhu sat for a long time. Then he stood up and silently looked out the window. It seemed that he remembered that it was time for him to go shopping, so he turned and pushed open the door to leave the room. He walked down the stairs and out of the inn into the icy rain. There were many spots of dirt on his clothes. They were marks left by a Jingdo urchin in an alley yesterday afternoon. He had been in a heavy mood all night and had not noticed this. No one would go shopping in the rain. Perhaps there were couples who liked to play around, holding umbrellas and walking in the rain, but there was no such thing in this world. Scholars held umbrellas and sang poems in the rain. Wu Zhu walked in the rain, covered in black cloth and clothed in plain clothes. Who knew how many people who were hiding from the rain looked at him in amazement. The icy rain soaked through Wu Zhu's clothes and swallowed up the dirty spots of mud. He walked silently and alone in the rain, passing through the streets and alleys of Jingdo. He allowed the rain to soak his forever black and beautiful hair, as well as the black cloth that had been covered by thousands of years of wind and frost. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.